7 men refused her. 7 rejection letters, each one colder than the last. In 1878 Montana Territory, Margaret Hale stood at the edge of Silver Hollow with nothing but a worn carpetbag and the crushing weight of being unwanted, too educated, too plain, too strong-willed. The frontier had no place for women like her, or so they said, but high in those mountains lived a man who would see what others missed, a man who would ask the one question that would change everything. Will you give me sons? This is the story of the mail-order bride nobody wanted, until one mountain man did. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Silver Hollow post office, sending up a cloud of dust that hung in the thin mountain air like a veil of judgment. Margaret Hale pressed her gloved hand against the window, staring out at the frontier town that was supposed to be her salvation. Instead, it looked like the end of the world. Wooden buildings lined the rutted main street, their paint peeling under the relentless Montana sun. Men in dusty work clothes moved with purpose between the general store and the saloon, their faces weathered by wind and hardship. A few women hurried along the boardwalk, their heads down, their dresses practical and worn. This was Silver Hollow, a place where survival mattered more than sentiment, where beauty was measured in how many acres you could plow and how many children you could bear. Margaret was about to fail on all counts. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You sure this is where you want to be?" She wanted to laugh at the question. Want had nothing to do with it. Want was a luxury for people with choices, and Margaret's choices had run out somewhere between Boston and the Montana Territory. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm sure." The driver climbed down and retrieved her trunk, a battered leather thing that had belonged to her father. Everything she owned in the world fit inside it: 3 dresses, 2 petticoats, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, her mother's silver brush, and 7 letters that she should have burned but couldn't quite let go of. 7 letters, 7 rejections. She stepped down from the coach, her boots sinking slightly into the dust. The afternoon sun beat down on her dark hair, pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to soften the sharp angles of her face. She knew what she looked like: tall for a woman, thin in all the wrong places, with intelligent gray eyes that men found unsettling rather than attractive. At 24, she was already being whispered about as a spinster back in Boston. Out here, she imagined, the whispers would be even less kind. "Miss Hale?" She turned to find a woman approaching, middle-aged and sturdy, with flour dusting the front of her apron, an expression that suggested she'd seen everything the frontier had to offer and hadn't been particularly impressed by any of it. "I'm Mrs. Porter," the woman said, looking Margaret up and down with the practiced eye of someone assessing livestock. "I run the boarding house. Mr. Jameson at the land office sent word you'd be needing a room." "Yes," Margaret said, grateful that at least someone in this town knew she was coming. "Thank you for accommodating me on such short notice, Mrs." Porter's eyebrows rose slightly at Margaret's accent, the precise, educated Boston inflection that had been one more strike against her in the eyes of the men who'd rejected her. Out here, education in a woman was viewed with the same suspicion as a horse with a limp, potentially useful, but probably more trouble than it was worth. "Notice was fine," Mrs. Porter said. "Payment in advance is better. $2 a week, meals included. You'll share a room with 2 other girls who work at the dress shop." Margaret's heart sank. $2 a week. She had maybe $30 left from the sale of her parents' belongings, which meant she had 15 weeks to figure out how to survive in a place where she already didn't belong. "That's acceptable," she said, because what choice did she have? Mrs. Porter nodded toward the trunk. "Can you carry that, or do you need help?" "I can manage," Margaret said, gripping the handle. The trunk was heavy, but she'd learned long ago that showing weakness only invited more judgment. She followed Mrs. Porter down the boardwalk, acutely aware of the stares following her. News traveled fast in small towns, and she had no doubt that everyone in Silver Hollow already knew about the mail-order bride who'd been rejected 7 times. The boarding house was a 2-story structure at the end of the main street, its white paint fading to gray and its porch sagging slightly on one side. But it was clean, and through the open door, Margaret could smell bread baking, a small comfort in a world that had offered precious few of them lately. Supper's at 6, Mrs. Porter said, leading her up a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. You're expected to keep your room tidy and your behavior respectable. I don't tolerate drinking, gambling, or entertaining men after dark. This is a decent establishment. I understand, Margaret said. They reached the second floor, and Mrs. Porter opened a door to reveal a small room with 2 narrow beds, a single dresser, and a window that looked out over the mountains. The peaks rose in the distance, purple and majestic against the evening sky, so beautiful it made Margaret's chest ache. You'll take that bed, Mrs. Porter said, pointing to the one farthest from the window. Mary and Ruth will be back after the shop closes. They're good girls. Keep to themselves, mostly. Margaret set her trunk down at the foot of the bed, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over her like a physical thing. She'd been traveling for 2 weeks, by train, then by coach, then by another coach, each leg of the journey taking her farther from everything she'd known and deeper into a landscape that felt alien and unforgiving. Thank you, Mrs. Porter, she said. The older woman studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. You're not the first woman to come out here looking for a fresh start, she said quietly. And you won't be the last. The frontier's hard on everyone, but it's especially hard on women. You'll need to find work if you want to stay. I might have something for you in the kitchen if you're not afraid of hard labor. Pride warred with desperation in Margaret's chest. She'd been raised in a Boston townhouse, educated by private tutors, taught to speak French and play piano. Her father had been a professor of literature, her mother a poet of minor renown. The idea of scrubbing pots in a boarding house kitchen felt like a betrayal of everything they'd tried to give her. But they were dead, and she was alive. And survival didn't care about pride. I'm not afraid of hard work, she said. Mrs. Porter nodded. Good. Report to the kitchen at 5 tomorrow morning. We'll see what you're made of. After the landlady left, Margaret sank onto the thin mattress and allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of her situation. She pulled the letters from her carpet bag, spreading them across the faded quilt like cards in a cruel game of chance. The first letter, from a rancher named Thomas Brewster. While your credentials are impressive, I require a wife who can focus on domestic duties without the distraction of excessive education. I'm afraid we would not suit. The second, from a merchant. Your photograph suggests a serious disposition. I am seeking a companion of more pleasing temperament. The third, more blunt. Too old. The fourth, I need a woman who understands her place. Your letter suggests opinions that would create friction in a household. The fifth, my business requires a wife who can charm clients and host social gatherings. I fear you lack the necessary grace. The sixth, too tall. And the seventh, the one that had arrived just before she'd left Boston, the one that had finally broken something inside her. Miss Hale, I am seeking a wife, not a schoolteacher. Your evident intelligence would make you unhappy in the role I require, and would make me uncomfortable in my own home. I wish you well in your search, but we would be ill-matched. Too educated, too serious, too old, too opinionated, too graceless, too tall, too intelligent, too everything, apparently, except what men actually wanted. Margaret folded the letters carefully and tucked them back into her bag. She wouldn't read them again. There was no point in torturing herself with rejection when reality was doing a fine job of that on its own. Through the window, the mountains caught the last rays of sunlight, turning gold and crimson against the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, beyond the tree line, beyond the reach of this small town and its small judgments, there had to be something better. There had to be a place where being intelligent wasn't a curse, where being strong-willed wasn't a sin. But tonight, exhausted and alone in a room that smelled of cedar and desperation, Margaret couldn't imagine where that place might be. The kitchen work started at 5 the next morning, just as Mrs. Porter had promised. Margaret arrived to find the older woman already elbow-deep in biscuit dough, her face flushed from the heat of the massive iron stove. You're on time, Mrs. Porter said, sounding faintly surprised. That's something. Can you cook? I can learn, Margaret said. That's not what I asked. No, Margaret admitted. I can't cook, but I can read recipes, follow instructions, and I'm not afraid of burns or hard work. Mrs. Porter grunted, which Margaret chose to interpret as approval. Start with the potatoes, They need peeling for breakfast. There's a knife and a bucket by the sink. For the next 3 hours, Margaret peeled potatoes until her hands cramped and her back ached. She watched Mrs. Porter move through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, turning out trays of biscuits, slabs of fried ham, and scrambled eggs that fed the dozen or so residents of the boarding house. The work was mindless but demanding, and Margaret found a strange comfort in its simplicity. She'd spent her whole life in pursuits of the mind, reading philosophy, discussing literature, debating politics with her father's colleagues. None of that mattered here. Here, what mattered was whether the potatoes were peeled and whether the coffee was hot. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt almost like relief. The boarding house residents began filing into the dining room around 6:30, a mix of miners, ranch hands, and clerks from the various businesses in town. They ate quickly and efficiently, barely speaking to one another, their focus entirely on the food. Margaret served them from the kitchen, refilling coffee cups and bringing out more biscuits, all while keeping her eyes down and her mouth shut. She was clearing plates when she heard it, the low murmur of male voices from the corner table, punctuated by rough laughter. Heard she's the one nobody wanted. 7 men turned her down. Must be something real wrong with her. Margaret's hands tightened on the plates she was carrying, but she kept her face carefully neutral. This was what she'd expected. This was what she'd prepared herself for. The rejection letters had been private humiliation. Now came the public version. "Maybe she's barren," one of the men said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "That'd explain why nobody wanted her." "Or mean," another added. "Pretty don't matter if a woman's got a mean streak." "She ain't pretty anyway," the first man said, and they all laughed. Margaret walked back to the kitchen on legs that felt like wood, her face burning. Mrs. Porter looked up from the stove, her expression unreadable. "Don't pay them any mind," the older woman said quietly. "Men like that talk because they've got nothing better to do. They'll find someone else to gossip about by next week." But Margaret knew better. In a town this small, with entertainment this scarce, she would be the subject of gossip for far longer than a week. She would be the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters. See what happens when you think you're too good for honest work? See what happens when you get ideas above your station? She finished the morning shift in silence, her hands raw from washing dishes in water that was either scalding or freezing, never anything in between. By the time Mrs. Porter dismissed her at noon, Margaret's entire body ached, and her mind felt numb with exhaustion. "You did well enough," Mrs. Porter said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Be back at 4 to help with supper preparations. You'll get Sunday afternoons off, and I'll pay you $3 a week plus your room and board." $3 a week. It was barely anything, but it was more than nothing. Margaret nodded her thanks and climbed the stairs to her room, where her roommates, Mary and Ruth, had already left for their shifts at the dress shop. She should have rested. She should have saved her energy for the evening shift. Instead, she found herself pulling on her cloak and walking out into the town, drawn by a need to see something beyond the walls of the boarding house, to prove to herself that she could exist in this place without shame. Silver Hollow was busier now, the main street crowded with wagons and horses. The general store was doing brisk business, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out in a steady rhythm from his shop. Margaret walked slowly, her head high despite the stares and whispers that followed her. She passed the land office, the bank, the doctor's surgery. She passed the church with its white steeple reaching toward the sky, and the schoolhouse with its bell tower and tiny playground. Children played in the street, their laughter high and bright, and for a moment Margaret allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she might have children of her own, where she might belong to something larger than her own loneliness. But that life required a husband, and she'd been rejected by every man who'd even considered her. She was about to turn back toward the boarding house when she saw it, a notice board outside the post office, covered in scraps of paper advertising everything from lost cattle to upcoming dances. And there, near the bottom, a single sheet that made her stop in her tracks. Wanted. Schoolteacher for Silver Hollow Primary. Must be literate, patient, and willing to work for modest compensation. Inquire at the land office. Margaret stared at the notice, her heart beginning to pound. A schoolteacher. They needed a schoolteacher, She was literate, more than literate. She'd been reading since she was 4 years old, had devoured her father's entire library by the time she was 16. She'd studied Latin and Greek, mathematics, and natural philosophy. She'd written essays on Wordsworth and debated the merits of transcendentalism with her father's university colleagues, and they called that excessive education. They called that a liability. But here, in this rough frontier town, it might actually be worth something. Before she could talk herself out of it, Margaret walked into the land office. A clerk looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from bored to surprised when he saw her. "Help you, miss?" "The notice about the schoolteacher position," Margaret said, her voice steady. "I'd like to apply." The clerk blinked. "You're the mail-order bride? Miss Hale?" "I'm Margaret Hale," she said, lifting her chin. "And yes, I'd like to apply for the teaching position." "I don't know if—" The clerk glanced toward a closed door at the back of the office. "Let me get Mr. Jameson. He's handling the search." He disappeared through the door, and Margaret waited, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She could hear low voices from the back room, and then the door opened to reveal a portly man in his 50s, his waistcoat straining across his middle and his face skeptical. "Miss Hale," he said, looking her up and down. "Tom Jameson. I'm on the school board." "Mr. Jameson," Margaret said, "I understand you're looking for a teacher." "We are," he said slowly, "but I'm not sure you're what we had in mind." "Why not?" Margaret asked, even though she knew the answer. "Well, for one thing, you just got here. For another, you came here looking for a husband, not work. And for a third—" He trailed off, his discomfort obvious. "For a third, 7 men rejected me, and you're wondering what's wrong with me," Margaret finished for him. Jameson's face flushed. "Now, I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Margaret said. "Mr. Jameson, I have an extensive education. I've studied literature, mathematics, history, and natural sciences. I can read and write in 3 languages. I'm patient, organized, and I genuinely enjoy teaching. I tutored children in Boston before my parents passed away. I may not be what those 7 men wanted in a wife, but I'm exactly what you need in a teacher." Jameson rubbed his jaw, clearly uncomfortable. "The thing is, Miss Hale, we need someone who's going to stay. Teachers come and go out here. They get married or move on to bigger towns. We need stability." "I have nowhere else to go," Margaret said bluntly. "I'm not leaving Silver Hollow. This is my home now, whether I wanted it to be or not. You won't find anyone more committed to staying than I am." He studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his options. Finally, he sighed. "The pay is $30 a month," he said. "You'd be expected to teach Monday through Friday, all grades in one room. The children range from 5 to 14, and some of them are challenging. Their parents are ranchers and miners, working folk who don't always see the value in education. You'd have to win them over." $30 a month. It was more money than she'd ever imagined earning on her own. "I can do that," Margaret said. "School starts Monday morning," Jameson said. "That gives you 4 days to prepare. The schoolhouse is behind the church. You can go look at it this afternoon. Mrs. Wheeler has been filling in since our last teacher left, but she's eager to hand over the responsibility." "Thank you, Mr. Jameson," Margaret said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Walking out of the land office, she felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Hope. It was fragile and tentative, but it was there. She might not have found a husband, but she'd found something potentially better. A purpose. A way to support herself. A reason to stay. She spent the rest of the afternoon at the schoolhouse, a small wooden building with rows of worn desks and a blackboard that had seen better days. The space smelled of chalk and children and possibilities. Margaret stood at the front of the room, imagining it filled with students, imagining herself teaching them to read and write and think. This could work. This could actually work. But as she walked back to the boarding house that evening, she passed a group of women standing outside the general store. They fell silent when they saw her, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Margaret nodded politely and kept walking, but she could feel their stares like knife points between her shoulder blades. One voice carried on the wind, meant to be heard. "Schoolteacher, can you imagine? What kind of example is she going to set for our children? A woman nobody wanted, Margaret's steps didn't falter, but something inside her crystallized into a hard, cold determination. Let them gossip, let them judge. She would prove herself through her work, through her dedication. She would show this town that being unwanted didn't make her worthless. She would survive. And maybe, if she was very lucky, she would do more than survive. That night, lying in her narrow bed while Mary and Ruth whispered to each other in the darkness, Margaret stared at the ceiling and made herself a promise. She would not let rejection define her. She would not let this town's judgment break her. She had lost everything, her parents, her home, her dreams of marriage and family. But she still had herself. She still had her mind, her education, her stubborn refusal to disappear quietly into the footnotes of history. 7 men had rejected her. Fine. She didn't need them. What she needed was to wake up at 5 o'clock and help Mrs. Porter with breakfast, to spend her days teaching children who might be her only legacy, to carve out a small corner of this harsh world where she could exist without apology. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was life, and that would have to be enough. The next 3 days passed in a blur of work. Margaret rose before dawn to help in the boarding house kitchen, spent her afternoons preparing lessons at the schoolhouse, and fell into bed each night too exhausted to dream. Mrs. Porter proved to be a demanding but fair employer, and slowly, very slowly, Margaret began to learn the rhythms of frontier cooking. The schoolhouse became her sanctuary. She swept the floors, washed the windows, organized the few books available into some semblance of a library. She reviewed mathematics primers and planned lessons on geography and history. She even found a battered globe in a storage closet and spent an hour dusting it clean, imagining the wonder on children's faces when she showed them how vast the world really was. On Sunday, her half-day off, Margaret allowed herself to walk beyond the town's edge, following a trail that led up into the foothills. The mountains called to her in a way nothing else in Silver Hollow did, vast and indifferent, beautiful and dangerous. Up here, away from the judgment and whispers, she could breathe. She was standing on an outcrop of rock, looking down at the town spread below, when she heard the sound of horse hooves on the trail behind her. Margaret turned to see a rider approaching, a man on a large bay horse, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. He was tall, she could see even from a distance, with broad shoulders and a worn hat pulled low against the sun. As he drew closer, she noticed other things: dark hair, a thick beard, eyes that were cautious but not unfriendly. He pulled his horse to a stop when he saw her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. "Afternoon," he said finally, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle. "Good afternoon," Margaret replied, suddenly aware that she was alone on a mountain trail with a strange man. But something in his demeanor, a quietness, a respect for personal space, kept her from feeling afraid. "You're the new school teacher," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Margaret Hale. Caleb North." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that felt old-fashioned and courteous. "I have a homestead up the mountain. Don't make it to town often." "It's beautiful up here," Margaret said, because she didn't know what else to say. Caleb nodded, his gaze moving to the vista spread before them. "It is. Peaceful. No one around to bother you with their opinions." There was something in the way he said it that made Margaret look at him more closely. His clothes were well worn but clean, his hands rough with work. He had the look of a man who'd lived hard but honestly, and there was an intelligence in his eyes that surprised her. "You've heard about me then," she said. "About the 7 men." "I've heard gossip," Caleb said. "Don't put much stock in it." "Most people do." "Most people are fools." He said it matter-of-factly, without heat or judgment. "Begging your pardon for speaking plainly." Despite everything, Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. "Plain speaking is refreshing." Caleb studied her for a moment longer, and Margaret had the strangest sense of being truly seen, not assessed for her marriageability or judged for her failures, but simply acknowledged as a person standing on a mountainside. "Well," he said finally, "I should let you enjoy your walk. Sunday's the only day most folks get any peace." "Thank you for your courtesy, Mr. North." He nodded and urged his horse forward, the pack mule following behind. Margaret watched him ride up the trail until he disappeared around a bend, and only then did she realize that for the first time since arriving in Silver Hollow, someone had spoken to her without pity, without curiosity, without judgment. He'd simply spoken to her like a human being. It was such a small thing. But standing there in the mountain air with the sun warming her face and the town spread below like a collection of toy buildings, Margaret felt that fragile hope stir in her chest again. Maybe survival wasn't all she had to look forward to. Maybe, just maybe, there was kindness to be found in this harsh place. But kindness, as she would soon discover, came with complications of its own. Monday morning arrived cold and bright, and Margaret woke with her stomach in knots. Today she would meet her students, would begin to prove that she deserved the job Mr. Jameson had given her. She dressed carefully in her most severe dress, dark blue with a high collar, and pinned her hair back so tightly it pulled at her temples. She needed to look like a teacher. She needed to look like someone worthy of respect. The schoolhouse bell rang at 8 o'clock, and children began to arrive in groups of 2 and 3, some walking from town, others dropped off by parents in wagons. Margaret stood at the door to greet them, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their trembling. They ranged in age from tiny to nearly grown, from clean and well-dressed to dirty and ragged. Some looked at her with open curiosity, others with suspicion. One boy, perhaps 13, smirked as he passed her. "You're the mail-order bride," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The one nobody wanted." Several children giggled. Margaret's face burned, but she kept her voice level. "I'm Miss Hale," she said. "Your teacher. Take your seat, please." The boy, she would learn his name was Billy Henderson, swaggered to a desk in the back, clearly expecting her to let his comment pass. But Margaret had not survived rejection letters and boarding house gossip, and the death of her parents to be cowed by a 13-year-old bully. She waited until all the children were seated, 16 of them in total, ranging from a tiny girl of perhaps 5 to Billy and 2 other boys who looked nearly old enough to be working full-time. "Good morning," Margaret said, standing at the front of the classroom with her hands still clasped. "My name is Miss Hale, and I'll be your teacher this year. I know some of you have heard things about me, stories about why I came to Silver Hollow. I'm going to address those stories once, and then we're not going to speak of them again." The room went silent. Even Billy looked surprised. "It's true that I came to Montana Territory hoping to marry," Margaret said. "It's true that I was rejected by several men who didn't think we'd suit. Those are the facts. Here are some other facts. I can read and write in 3 languages. I've studied mathematics through calculus. I know the history of this country better than most people you'll meet. And I'm going to teach you everything I know because education is the most valuable thing any of you will ever receive." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Now," she continued, "you can choose to respect me or not. That's your decision. But you will behave respectfully in this classroom or you will answer to me and to your parents. Are we clear?" Slowly, hesitantly, heads began to nod. "Good," Margaret said. "Let's begin." The day was challenging but not impossible. The younger children were eager and sweet, hanging on her every word. The middle-aged students were restless but manageable. The older boys, Billy and his friends, tested her constantly, whispering during lessons, dropping books, making comments just quiet enough that she couldn't quite call them out. But Margaret held firm. She was patient with genuine mistakes and strict with deliberate disruption. She made the lessons as engaging as she could, using the globe to teach geography, acting out historical events, turning mathematics into puzzles to be solved. By the end of the day, she was exhausted but triumphant. She'd survived. More than that, she'd actually taught them something. As the children filed out, chattering about their assignments, Billy Henderson hung back. Margaret braced herself for another confrontation, but the boy just stood there, shuffling his feet. "Miss Hale?" he said finally. "Yes, Billy?" "That thing you said about the Roman Empire falling because it got too big to manage, was that really true?" Margaret looked at him, seeing past the bravado to the curiosity beneath. "Yes," she said, "it really was. Would you like to borrow a book about it?" Billy shrugged, trying to look disinterested. "Maybe." "I'll find one for you tomorrow," Margaret said. He nodded and left quickly, as if afraid of being seen showing interest. But Margaret smiled as she cleaned the blackboard. 1 student won over, 15 more to go. That evening, as she helped Mrs. Porter prepare supper, the landlady gave her an appraising look. Heard you had your first day teaching, she said. News traveled fast, as always. It went well, Margaret said cautiously. Billy Henderson's mother came by the store this afternoon, Mrs. Porter continued, said her boy actually talked about school at dinner, said he wanted to know more about Romans. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. He's a bright boy, just bored. Most of them are, Mrs. Porter said, bright and bored and stuck in a town with nowhere to go. You might actually do some good here, Miss Hale. It was the closest thing to praise Margaret had received since arriving in Silver Hollow, and she held on to it like a treasure. The weeks began to pass, each one bleeding into the next. Margaret fell into a routine. Kitchen work in the mornings, teaching during the day, lesson planning in the evenings. Sunday afternoons, she walked into the foothills, letting the mountains calm the constant anxiety that hummed beneath her skin. The children warmed to her slowly but surely. Even Billy Henderson began showing up early to ask questions about history or to borrow books from her small collection. Parents nodded to her on the street, and the whispers died down. Not completely, but enough that she could walk through town without feeling like a spectacle. She was surviving. More than surviving, she was building something that resembled a life. But late at night, lying in her narrow bed, Margaret couldn't help but wonder if this was all there would ever be. Work and exhaustion and small victories. No companionship beyond casual acquaintanceship. No love, no partnership, no family of her own. Just survival, dressed up as purpose. It should have been enough. She told herself it was enough. But sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleeping, she allowed herself to remember Caleb North standing on that mountain trail, speaking to her like an equal. Sometimes she wondered if she'd ever see him again. And sometimes, though she tried not to admit this even to herself, she hoped she would. Winter was coming to the Montana Territory. Margaret could feel it in the morning air, in the way the mountains seemed to draw closer to the town, as if offering shelter or warning. She didn't yet know that everything was about to change. She didn't know that a storm was coming, not just in the weather, but in her life. And she didn't know that the man on the mountain had already made his decision. October arrived with a vengeance, bringing frost that turned the grass silver and winds that rattled the windows of the schoolhouse. Margaret added another layer beneath her dress and taught her students with hands that sometimes trembled from cold rather than nerves. The pot-bellied stove in the corner worked hard to heat the single room, but on the worst days, the children huddled close to it during lessons, their breath visible in the air. She'd been teaching for 6 weeks now, and the transformation still amazed her. The students who'd once looked at her with suspicion or mockery now competed for her attention. Even Billy Henderson had become something close to an ally, helping the younger children with their arithmetic and defending her when his friends made jokes about the rejected mail-order bride. "She's smart," she'd overheard him say one day. "Smarter than any of us, smarter than most of the men in this town, if you ask me." It was the highest compliment Margaret had ever received. But teaching 16 children of varying ages and abilities was exhausting work, and the dual job of kitchen duties and lesson preparation left her drained by the end of each day. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and dark circles had taken up permanent residence beneath her eyes. Mrs. Porter had started leaving extra biscuits on her plate at breakfast, a kindness neither of them acknowledged aloud. On a Thursday afternoon, with snow threatening in the heavy gray clouds, Margaret dismissed her students early and began preparing the schoolhouse for the weekend. She was washing the blackboard when she heard the door open behind her. "Forgot your—" she began, turning with a smile, expecting one of her students. But it wasn't a student, it was Caleb North. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking somehow both out of place and completely at ease in the small schoolhouse. He was dressed much as he'd been on the mountain trail, work clothes, sturdy boots, a sheepskin coat against the cold. But there was something different about him now, a tension in his shoulders that suggested he hadn't come here casually. "Mr. North," Margaret said, surprised, "is something wrong?" "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I was wondering if I could have a word, if you're not too busy." Margaret set down her cloth, her heart beginning to beat faster for reasons she couldn't quite name. "Of course, please, come in." Caleb stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He looked at the neat rows of desks, the carefully written lessons still on the blackboard, The small library of books Margaret had organized on shelves she'd built herself from scrap lumber. "You've done well here," he said. "I've heard talk in town. The children are learning." "They're good students," Margaret said, unsure where this conversation was heading. "Most of them, anyway. They just need someone to challenge them." Caleb nodded, turning his hat slowly in his hands. He seemed to be struggling with something, and Margaret waited, giving him time. "Miss Hale," he said finally, "I'm not a man who speaks well or knows how to dress things up pretty, so I'm going to say this plain, and you can tell me to leave if you want to." Margaret's mouth went dry. "All right." "I've been thinking about you since we met on that trail," Caleb said, his eyes meeting hers directly. "Not in any improper way, just thinking about what you said, about the 7 men, about how people talk." "Mr. North." "Let me finish, please," he said gently. "I've lived alone on that mountain for 8 years, built my homestead from nothing, cleared the land, raised my stock. It's a good life, but it's lonely. I always figured I'd find a wife someday, but I never got around to it. Work came first, and then more work, and then it seemed like maybe it was too late." He paused, and Margaret found she couldn't breathe. "I don't need a wife who's pretty," Caleb continued. "Pretty fades. I don't need someone who'll just smile and nod and keep quiet. I've got enough silence in my life already. What I need is a partner, someone strong enough to survive the winters, smart enough to help me make decisions, honest enough to tell me when I'm wrong." "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew. "Because I think you might be that person," Caleb said simply. "I know you came here looking for something different. I know those 7 men turned you down for reasons that had nothing to do with your actual worth. But I'm not them, Miss Hale. I'm asking you to consider something different than what you planned." Margaret's hands were shaking now. "You're asking me to marry you." "I'm asking if you'd be willing to talk about it," Caleb said. "Not today, not this minute, but to consider it. To maybe let me call on you proper. Let me show you what my life is like up there. Let you decide if it's something you could see yourself in." "I barely know you," Margaret whispered. "That's what calling on someone is for," Caleb said with the ghost of a smile. "Getting to know each other. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm just asking if you'd give me a chance that those other men never gave you, the chance to see past first impressions." Margaret turned away from him, walking to the window where she could see the town spread below and the mountains rising beyond. Her mind was racing. This was what she'd wanted when she'd first come to Montana, a husband, a home, a future. But she'd built something else here, something she'd earned through her own work and determination. "I have a job," she said. "The children need me." "The children will have other teachers," Caleb said. "But you'll only have one life, Miss Hale. One chance to decide what you want it to look like." "What do you want it to look like?" she asked, still not turning around. "What do you expect from a wife?" "Partnership," Caleb said immediately. "Someone to work beside, not behind, someone to talk to at the end of the day. And yes, eventually children if we're blessed with them, but mostly just companionship. Someone to share the weight of living with." Margaret closed her eyes. It was so simple, the way he said it, so honest. None of the flowery promises or elaborate courtship rituals she'd expected. Just one lonely person asking another if they might be less lonely together. "I need to think," she said. "Of course," Caleb said. "Take all the time you need. I'll be in town through tomorrow, staying at the boarding house. If you want to talk more, you can find me there. If you don't, well, I'll understand that too." She heard his footsteps crossing the wooden floor, heard the door open and close. Only then did she turn around, finding the schoolhouse empty again, the silence somehow heavier than it had been before. Margaret sank into her chair and pressed her hands to her face. What was she supposed to do with this? She'd spent weeks convincing herself that teaching was enough, that independence was better than marriage to someone who didn't truly want her. She'd built walls around the parts of herself that had hoped for love and family, telling herself those things weren't meant for women like her. And now Caleb North had appeared with his quiet honesty and his offer of partnership, threatening to tear those walls down. She thought about the 7 men who'd rejected her. They'd wanted beauty, compliance, domestic perfection. They'd wanted women who would make them comfortable, who would reflect well on them in social situations, who would ask nothing and expect less. Caleb seemed to want something entirely different. He wanted an equal. But could she trust that? Could she trust that he wasn't just desperate? That he wouldn't change his expectations once she was isolated on his mountain with no way to leave? Margaret spent a sleepless night turning these questions over in her mind. Mary and Ruth whispered sympathetically from their shared bed. News of Caleb's visit had already spread through the boarding house, but she barely heard them. She was too busy weighing her fear against her longing, her hard-won independence against the ache of loneliness that never quite went away. By morning, she'd made a decision. She found Caleb at breakfast, sitting alone at a corner table with a plate of eggs and biscuits. He looked up when she approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. North," Margaret said, "might I join you?" "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She sat, folding her hands on the table, a Mrs. Porter appeared almost immediately with coffee, giving Margaret a significant look that she chose to ignore. "I've thought about your offer," Margaret said once they were alone again. "And?" Caleb's voice was calm, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "I'll agree to let you call on me," Margaret said carefully, "with conditions." "Name them." "First, I want to see your homestead. I want to understand what life would actually be like there before I make any commitments." "Fair enough," Caleb said. "I can take you up there this Sunday, if the weather holds." "Second, I won't give up teaching until I'm certain this is the right choice. Mr. Jameson and the school board deserve notice, and the children deserve consistency." "Agreed. Though I should tell you the homestead is 2 hours from town. You couldn't teach and live up there. You'd have to choose." Margaret had known that, but hearing it stated so plainly made it feel more real. "I understand. Anything else?" Caleb asked. "Yes," Margaret said, meeting his eyes. "I need you to understand that I'm not desperate. I have work, I have purpose, I have a life here that I built from nothing. If I agree to marry you, it won't be because I have no other choice. It will be because I believe we could build something better together than we have separately." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, respect, maybe, or relief. "That's all I'm asking for, Miss Hale. A real choice, made with open eyes." "Then we have an understanding," Margaret said. "We do," Caleb agreed. He extended his hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Margaret shook it. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm, but not crushing. "I'll call for you Sunday morning," he said. "Dress warm. It's colder up the mountain." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. What had she just agreed to? The next 2 days dragged by with excruciating slowness. Margaret taught her classes in a distracted haze, her mind constantly drifting to Sunday and what she might find at Caleb's homestead. The children noticed her preoccupation and took advantage of it, growing louder and more restless until she finally had to snap them back to attention. "I apologize," she said on Friday afternoon, after an arithmetic lesson that had devolved into chaos. "I've been unfair to you today. You deserve better." "Are you sick, Miss Hale?" little Emma Morrison asked, her face worried. "No, sweetheart, just thinking about things." "Grown-up things?" Emma persisted. "Yes, grown-up things." Billy Henderson raised his hand. "Is it true Mr. North is courting you?" The room went silent, 16 pairs of eyes fixed on Margaret's face. "Mr. North has asked permission to call on me," Margaret said carefully, "which is a private matter, but since you're all going to gossip about it anyway, I might as well confirm it." "Are you going to marry him?" Billy asked. "I don't know yet," Margaret said honestly. "That's what courting is for, to figure out if two people suit each other." "My ma says you'd be crazy not to," one of the girls piped up. "She says Mr. North is the most eligible bachelor in the territory." "Your mother is entitled to her opinion," Margaret said dryly. "Now, can we please return to arithmetic?" But the damage was done. The news that Caleb North, respected, self-sufficient, mysteriously reclusive Caleb North, was courting the rejected mail-order bride spread through Silver Hollow like wildfire. By Saturday morning, Margaret couldn't walk down the street without people staring and whispering. Some of the attention was kind. Mrs. Porter squeezed her shoulder and said, "Good for you, dear." The doctor's wife stopped her outside the general store to say that Caleb was a good man, if a bit too fond of solitude, but some of it was bitter. Margaret overheard two women outside the church talking in voices that carried. Can you imagine? 7 men reject her, but Caleb North thinks she's good enough? He's been alone too long. Any woman probably looks good when you're that desperate. She probably threw herself at him. What else could it be? Margaret kept walking, her head high, her hands clenched inside her cloak. Let them think what they wanted. She was done caring about the opinions of people who'd never shown her kindness. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear, the sky a brilliant blue that hurt to look at. Margaret dressed in her warmest clothes, heavy wool dress, thick stockings, sturdy boots, and braided her hair tightly to keep it out of her face. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw not a mail-order bride or a rejected woman, but someone about to make a choice that could change everything. Caleb arrived at the boarding house exactly when he'd said he would, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 draft horses. He helped Margaret up to the seat, his hands steady and respectful, and wrapped a thick blanket around her legs. It's a fair ride, he said, climbing up beside her. About 2 hours. We'll take it slow. They left town heading north, following a trail that climbed steadily into the foothills. For the first half hour, neither of them spoke much. Margaret watched the landscape change around them, the scattered houses giving way to open rangeland, then to forest, then to steeper slopes where aspen trees showed their white bark like bones against the darker pines. Tell me about your homestead, Margaret said finally. What do you want to know? Everything. How you came to be there. What you've built. What a typical day looks like. Caleb was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I came west 8 years ago from Ohio, he said. My family had a farm there, but my older brother inherited it. I could have stayed and worked for him, but I wanted something of my own. So I came to Montana with a wagon, some tools, and enough supplies to last a winter. That must have been difficult. It was hell, Caleb said bluntly. That first year, I lived in a tent and nearly froze to death. Built a 1-room cabin by hand, cutting every log myself. Almost gave up a dozen times. But I'd come too far to turn back, and I was too stubborn to admit defeat. What made you choose that particular spot? Water, Caleb said. There's a creek that runs through the property year-round. Good grazing land, enough timber for building, and high enough that I don't have to worry about flooding. It's isolated, but that's what I wanted. Space to breathe, room to build something without anyone looking over my shoulder. Margaret could understand that. What do you raise? Cattle, mostly. About 30 head now. Some chickens, a couple of pigs, a vegetable garden in summer. I hunt and trap in winter for extra income. It's not fancy living, but it's honest work. And the land, he paused, searching for words. The land is mine. No one can take it from me. There was something almost fierce in the way he said it, and Margaret understood that too. Ownership, autonomy, the security of knowing you'd built something that couldn't be taken away. Do you ever get lonely? She asked. Every day, Caleb said without hesitation. That's the price of living alone. You get peace, but you lose companionship. No one to talk to except the animals. No one to share a meal with. No one to help when you're sick or injured. Have you been injured? Last winter I broke my arm when a horse threw me, Caleb said. Took me 6 hours to splint it myself and get down the mountain for help. Doctor said I did a decent job, but it was the longest 6 hours of my life. Margaret shuddered at the image. That's frightening. It's reality, Caleb said. That's why I'm being honest with you, Miss Hale. Life up there is hard. Beautiful, but hard. If you came with me, you'd be isolated for weeks at a time during winter. You'd have to work from sunrise to sunset. You'd have to know how to shoot, how to tend stock, how to survive if something happened to me. You're not making a very good case for yourself, Margaret said. For the first time, she heard him laugh, a low, rusty sound that suggested he didn't do it often. I'm making an honest case. I won't lie to you about what you'd be getting into. That's not fair to either of us. They climbed higher, the trail narrowing as it wound between rocks and trees. Margaret could see her breath in the cold air, could feel the altitude in the way her lungs worked harder. But the view was stunning. The valley spread below them, the town just a cluster of buildings in the distance, the mountains marching away in every direction like frozen waves. It's beautiful, she whispered. Wait, Caleb said. You haven't seen anything yet. 20 minutes later, they crested a ridge, and Margaret gasped. The homestead lay in a natural bowl between peaks, sheltered from the worst winds but open to the southern sun. A sturdy cabin stood at the center, larger than she'd expected, with glass windows and a stone chimney from which smoke rose in a thin line. A barn stood nearby, and beyond it, fenced pastures where cattle grazed. A creek cut through the property, its water catching the light like silver thread. But it was the view that took her breath away. On three sides, mountains rose like cathedral walls. The fourth side opened onto the valley, giving a vista that stretched for miles. It was isolated and wild and achingly beautiful. "This is yours?" Margaret asked. "Every acre," Caleb said, and she could hear the pride in his voice. 160 acres under the Homestead Act. I've got the papers to prove it. He drove the wagon down to the cabin, and Margaret climbed down on shaking legs. Up close, she could see that the cabin was well built, with tight corners and a solid roof. The barn was equally sturdy, and she could hear chickens clucking somewhere inside. "Come on," Caleb said. "I'll show you inside." The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, and Margaret could feel its warmth the moment she stepped through the door. The furniture was simple but well made. A table and chairs, a rocking chair by the fire, shelves lining the walls. Everything was scrupulously clean and organized. "You built all this yourself?" Margaret asked, running her hand along the smooth wood of the table. "Most of it. Traded for some things, the glass windows, the iron stove. But the rest, yes." Margaret walked slowly around the room, taking it all in. There were books on the shelves, not many, but more than she'd expected. A few decorative touches suggested a man who cared about more than just survival. A carved wooden box, a colorful woven rug, wildflowers in a jar on the table. "The loft is for sleeping," Caleb said, pointing to the ladder. "If you wanted to come here, I'd build another room, a proper bedroom for privacy. I'm handy with tools. It wouldn't take long." Margaret turned to face him. "You've been planning this." "I've been hoping," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference." She looked at him standing in his own home and saw him differently than she had in town. Here, he was completely at ease, moving with the confidence of a man in his own domain. This was where he belonged. The question was whether she could belong here too. "Show me the rest," she said. They spent the next hour walking the property. Caleb showed her the barn where his cattle shelter in bad weather, the chicken coop, the summer garden plot, the creek where he gets water. He explained his routines, his plans for expansion, the challenges of each season. He answered every question Margaret asked with patient honesty. "In winter, we'd be snowed in for weeks at a time," he said. "You'd need to be comfortable with that. It's just you and me and the work. No neighbors to visit, no town to walk to." "But spring comes eventually," Margaret said. "Spring comes," Caleb agreed, "and it's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. The whole mountain turns green and wildflowers cover the meadows, and you remember why you chose to live here." They were standing by the creek now, and Margaret bent to trail her fingers in the icy water. She'd come here expecting to find reasons to say no: isolation, hardship, fear. Instead, she'd found something that called to her in a way the town never had. Here, she could breathe. Here, the air was so clear it hurt. Here, no one would judge her for being too educated or too plain or too anything. Here, she could just be. "I need to be honest with you too," Margaret said, straightening to face him. "I came to Montana hoping for love, romance, the kind of partnership where two people build a life together because they genuinely care for each other, not just because it's convenient." "I understand that," Caleb said. "Do you?" Margaret challenged. "Because what you're offering sounds very practical. Partnership, companionship, shared work. Those are all good things, but they're not love." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "I can't promise you love, Miss Hale. Not right away. I barely know you, and you barely know me. But I can promise you respect, honesty, loyalty, and I can promise that I'll try, really try, to build something real with you. Not just a practical arrangement, but a true partnership where we both matter." "And if love never comes," Margaret asked, "what then?" Then we'll have built something good anyway, Caleb said. Respect and partnership aren't small things. They're more than most married people have. He was right about that. Margaret thought of her parents, who had loved each other deeply, but whose marriage had been fraught with tension over money, over her father's drinking, over her mother's thwarted ambitions. Love hadn't been enough to make them happy. I'm not ready to give you an answer today, Margaret said. I'm not asking for one, Caleb replied. I'm asking you to keep thinking, to maybe let me call on you again, properly in town where people can see we're doing this right. The gossip will be terrible, Margaret warned. Let it be terrible, Caleb said with a shrug. People always talk. Doesn't mean we have to listen. They loaded back into the wagon as the afternoon shadows grew long. The ride down the mountain was quieter than the ride up, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with chatter. When they reached the boarding house, Caleb helped Margaret down from the wagon. His hands lingered on her waist for just a moment, not improper, but enough that she felt the warmth of them through her dress. Thank you for today, she said, for showing me your home, for being honest. Thank you for coming, Caleb said, for giving me a chance. He drove away, and Margaret stood on the porch watching until the wagon disappeared around a corner. Then she went inside, climbed the stairs to her room, and lay on her bed staring at the ceiling. She'd been so certain that teaching was enough, that independence was better than marriage to someone who didn't fully value her. But now she wasn't certain of anything except that Caleb North had shown her something she hadn't expected, a future that might actually be worth wanting. The question was whether she was brave enough to reach for it. Margaret woke Monday morning with her mind made up, or so she told herself. She would continue teaching, continue building her independent life in Silver Hollow, and politely decline Caleb's courtship. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. But by the time she reached the schoolhouse, her resolve had already begun to crumble. The week passed in a strange fog. Margaret taught her lessons mechanically, her mind constantly drifting to the mountain homestead, to the view that stretched for miles, to the quiet competence in Caleb's hands as he'd shown her around his property. She found herself comparing everything in town to what she'd seen up there, the crowded, noisy boarding house against the peaceful cabin, the gossip and judgment of Silver Hollow against the solitude of the mountains. Caleb came to town on Wednesday, just as he'd promised. Margaret saw him from the schoolhouse window, talking with Mr. Jameson outside the land office. Later, she learned he'd been buying supplies at the general store, where he'd casually mentioned to several people that he was courting Miss Hale properly, with all due respect and propriety. The gossip that had been dying down roared back to life. Did you hear? Caleb North is serious about her. Took her up to his homestead, bold as you please. My husband says Caleb's a smart man. Maybe he sees something the rest of us don't. Or maybe he's just desperate. 8 years alone will make any man lose his standards. Margaret heard it all, absorbed it all, and tried not to let it matter. But on Friday afternoon, when Billy Henderson lingered after class, she found herself actually grateful for the distraction. Miss Hale, the boy said, shuffling his feet in that way he had when he wanted to ask something but didn't know how. Yes, Billy? Are you really going to marry Mr. North? Margaret set down the chalk she'd been using. I don't know yet. Why do you ask? Because if you do, you'll have to stop teaching, Billy said. And the other kids and me, we don't want you to go. Something warm and painful bloomed in Margaret's chest. That's very kind of you to say. It's not kind, it's true, Billy insisted. You're the best teacher we've ever had. You actually make us think instead of just memorizing stuff. And you don't treat us like we're stupid just because we live in a small town. You're not stupid, Margaret said gently. Not a single one of you. My pa says you should marry Mr. North, Billy continued. He says a woman needs a husband and that teaching is just something you're doing until you get one. But I don't think that's true. I think you actually want to teach. Margaret looked at this 13-year-old boy who'd started the school year trying to humiliate her and had somehow become one of her staunchest defenders. I do want to teach, she admitted. But I also want other things. A home, a family, partnership with someone who sees me as an equal. Is it so wrong to want both? I don't know, Billy said honestly. But it seems like you have to choose, and that's not fair. No, Margaret agreed. It's not fair, but life rarely is. Billy nodded solemnly, suddenly looking much older than his 13 years. Well, whatever you decide, I hope you're happy, Miss Hale. You deserve to be happy. After he left, Margaret sat alone in the empty schoolhouse and cried. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming complexity of her situation. She'd come to Montana expecting rejection, had found purpose instead, and now that purpose was at war with the possibility of something more. She was still sitting there, her face damp and her eyes red, when she heard footsteps on the porch. The door opened, and Caleb stood there, his expression shifting from neutral to concerned the moment he saw her. Miss Hale, he said, stepping inside quickly and closing the door behind him. What's wrong? Did something happen? Nothing happened, Margaret said, wiping at her eyes. I'm just thinking. Those must be some powerful thoughts, Caleb said, pulling up one of the student chairs and sitting across from her. He looked absurd in the small seat, his long legs bent at awkward angles, but he seemed unconcerned with his dignity. Billy Henderson told me I deserve to be happy, Margaret said, and I realized I don't know what that looks like anymore. Caleb was quiet for a moment. What did it look like before? Back in Boston? It looked like my parents, Margaret said, my mother writing poetry at the kitchen table while my father graded papers. Arguments about money and ambition, but also laughter and long conversations about books and ideas. It looked like having someone who understood me, who valued my mind as much as anything else. That sounds good, Caleb said carefully. It was, Margaret said, until my father started drinking and my mother got sick and everything fell apart. They loved each other desperately, but love wasn't enough to save them from grief and poverty and disappointment. Is that why you agreed to become a mail-order bride? Caleb asked. Because you were looking for something more practical than love? Margaret laughed bitterly. I agreed because I had no choice. My parents died within 6 months of each other. The bank took the house. I had no family, no prospects, no way to support myself in Boston. Coming west seemed like my only option. And those 7 men turned you down. They didn't just turn me down, Margaret said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. They made it clear exactly what was wrong with me. Too educated, too opinionated, too plain, too tall, too serious, too everything that I actually am, and not enough of what they wanted me to be. Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Did it ever occur to you that maybe there was nothing wrong with you? That maybe those men were just fools who didn't recognize value when they saw it? Everyone can't be a fool, Margaret said. 7 different men, 7 different rejections. At some point, I have to accept that the problem is me. No, Caleb said firmly. You don't. Margaret looked at him, this quiet mountain man who'd appeared in her life asking impossible questions. You want to know what I saw when I met you on that trail? Caleb continued. I saw a woman who'd been knocked down but was still standing, who'd come to a place where she wasn't wanted and made herself necessary anyway, who looked at those mountains like they were a promise instead of a threat. That's not a woman with something wrong with her. That's a woman with strength most people never find. Then why are you courting me? Margaret challenged. If I'm so strong, why do I need a husband? You don't need a husband, Caleb said. You could keep teaching, keep building your life here in town. You'd probably be fine. But fine isn't the same as fulfilled, is it? He was right, and Margaret hated that he was right. I'm courting you because I think we could build something better together than we have separately, Caleb said. Not because you need rescuing, but because partnership, real partnership, makes hard things easier and good things better. At least that's what I'm hoping for. And what if I can't give you what you need? Margaret asked. What if I'm not cut out for mountain living? What if I miss teaching too much? What if... Then we'll figure it out, Caleb interrupted. Together. That's what partnership means, isn't it? Facing problems together instead of alone? Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to poke holes in his logic, wanted to protect herself from the possibility of more rejection. But sitting there in the fading afternoon light, looking at this man who spoke to her with more honesty than anyone ever had, she found she couldn't. I'm scared, she admitted. I know, Caleb said. So am I. You're scared. Terrified, he said. I've been alone for 8 years. I've built my whole life around solitude. asking someone to share it with me, risking that they might say no or might say yes and then regret it. That scares me more than anything I've faced on that mountain." They sat in silence for a moment, two frightened people trying to navigate towards something neither of them fully understood. "I need more time," Margaret said finally. "Take it," Caleb said. "I'm not going anywhere." He stood to leave but paused at the door. "Miss Hale? Margaret? Whatever you decide, I want you to know something. You're not too anything. You're exactly enough just as you are. Those 7 men were wrong, and Silver Hollow is wrong, and anyone who can't see your worth is blind." Then he was gone, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and a heart that felt like it might crack open from the pressure of wanting and fearing in equal measure. The next day was Saturday, and Margaret spent it in a state of restless energy. She helped Mrs. Porter with the baking, cleaned her room until it sparkled, reorganized her small library of teaching materials 3 times. Nothing settled her mind. In the afternoon, she walked to the general store to purchase writing paper. She was browsing the shelves when she heard voices from the next aisle, women's voices, discussing her with the casual cruelty of people who don't expect to be overheard. "I still can't believe Caleb North is courting her. What does he see in that dried-up spinster? Maybe he feels sorry for her. You know how men can be. They see a woman struggling and think they need to rescue her." More like she threw herself at him. What else would she do? No one else wanted her. Well, I give it 6 months before he realizes his mistake. Mountain living is hard enough without being stuck with a wife who thinks she's smarter than her husband. If she even makes it that long. I heard she's never done a day of real work in her life. All that fancy education won't help her milk cows or butcher chickens. Margaret's hands tightened on the writing paper she was holding. She could confront them, could defend herself, could point out that she'd been working from dawn to dusk since the day she arrived in Silver Hollow. But what would be the point? People like that had already made up their minds. Instead, she paid for her purchase and walked out with her head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd hurt her. But they had hurt her. The words burrowed under her skin like splinters, making her question everything. Was Caleb courting her out of pity? Would she fail at mountain living? Was she making a fool of herself all over again? She was so lost in thought that she didn't see the storm clouds gathering until the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time she was halfway back to the boarding house, the sky had opened up completely, drenching her in cold October rain. Margaret quickened her pace, but the street had already turned to mud, sucking at her boots with every step. She was soaked through and shivering when a wagon pulled up beside her. "Get in," Caleb said, reaching down to help her up. Margaret didn't argue. She accepted his hand and climbed onto the seat, where he immediately wrapped her in a thick blanket. "What are you doing in town?" she asked through chattering teeth. "Had business at the bank," Caleb said, urging the horses forward. "Lucky for you." "Lucky for me," Margaret agreed. They'd gone less than a quarter mile when the rain intensified into something truly biblical, sheets of water that made it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. The horses balked, tossing their heads nervously. "This is bad," Caleb said, his jaw tight. "We need to get off the road." "How far to the boarding house?" Margaret asked. "Too far in this," Caleb said. He seemed to make a decision. "There's a line cabin about a mile north, used by ranchers during cattle drives. It's shelter, at least." He turned the wagon off the main road onto what was barely more than a track. The horses struggled through mud that threatened to mire the wheels, but Caleb kept them moving with steady encouragement. Margaret huddled under the blanket, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, her teeth chattering so hard she bit her tongue. The line cabin appeared through the rain like a mirage, a small rough structure that had clearly seen better days. Caleb pulled the wagon as close as possible to the door and jumped down. "Stay there," he shouted over the storm. "Let me check it's safe." He disappeared inside and Margaret heard him moving around. A moment later, he reappeared. "It's dry at least, come on." He reached up and lifted her bodily from the wagon, carrying her the few feet to the cabin door before setting her down inside. Then he went back out to tend to the horses, unhitching them and leading them to a small lean-to shelter attached to the cabin. Margaret looked around the interior. It was a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. Cobwebs hung from the corners, and the floor was thick with dust, but it was dry and relatively warm. Caleb came back inside, water streaming from his hat and coat. He immediately went to the fireplace, where someone had left kindling and logs. "There should be matches somewhere," he muttered, searching the mantel. "Here," Margaret said, finding a tin on the table. Within minutes, Caleb had a fire going. He hung his coat near the flames and gestured for Margaret to do the same with her cloak. "We're stuck here until the storm passes," he said. "Could be an hour, could be all night. These October storms are unpredictable." Margaret's heart began to pound, but not from fear of the storm. "All night?" "Maybe," Caleb said. He looked at her, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "That's going to cause talk." "That's going to cause more than talk," Margaret said. "If anyone finds out I spent the night alone with you in this cabin, your reputation will be destroyed," Caleb finished. "I know. But what choice do we have? We can't go back out in this storm. The wagon would never make it, and we'd both catch pneumonia." He was right, but that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. Margaret sank onto the edge of the cot, her mind racing through implications. She'd worked so hard to build her reputation in Silver Hollow, to become someone respectable despite the rejection letters. One night in this cabin with Caleb would undo all of that. "Hey," Caleb said gently, crouching in front of her. "Look at me." Margaret met his eyes. "Nothing inappropriate is going to happen here," he said. "I give you my word. You'll sleep on that cot, and I'll sleep on the floor by the fire. When the storm passes, we'll head back to town, and if anyone asks, I'll tell them exactly what happened, that you got caught in a storm and I got you to shelter. That's all." "They won't believe that," Margaret said. "They'll assume the worst." "Let them assume," Caleb said. "We'll know the truth." But Margaret understood something Caleb perhaps didn't. The truth mattered very little when it came to a woman's reputation. Once the gossip started, once the whispers began, it wouldn't matter what had actually happened in this cabin. What would matter was what people believed had happened. "You should have left me on the street," Margaret said bitterly. "Let me walk back in the rain. At least then you might have died from the cold," Caleb interrupted. "That's not a trade I'm willing to make." The storm raged outside, wind howling through gaps in the walls and rain hammering on the roof. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, gradually warming the small space. Margaret's clothes began to steam as they dried, and her shivering finally stopped. Caleb found a dented pot in a corner and went out briefly to fill it with rainwater from the barrel by the door. He set it to heat over the fire, and when it was warm enough, he made them both weak tea from a packet someone had left in the cabin. "Not much," he said, handing her a chipped cup. "But it's hot." Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm and sipping their tea. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said finally. "Yes." "What are you really afraid of? Is it life on the mountain, or is it trusting me?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Both," she said honestly. "But mostly I'm afraid of wanting something and having it taken away. Or worse, having it and realizing it wasn't what I thought it was." "Like your parents' marriage," Caleb said. "Like my parents' marriage," Margaret agreed. "They loved each other so much, but it wasn't enough. Love didn't stop my father from drinking. It didn't save my mother from consumption. It didn't prevent them from dying and leaving me alone." "So you think it's safer not to want anything at all?" Caleb said. "Isn't it?" Margaret challenged. "If you don't want, you can't be disappointed." "No," Caleb said slowly, "but you also can't be happy. You just exist, going through motions, never feeling anything deeply. That's not living, Margaret. That's just not dying." His words hit her like a physical blow because they were true. She'd been telling herself that teaching was enough, that independence was enough, that survival was enough. But none of it had filled the hollow ache in her chest that came from wanting connection, wanting partnership, wanting to matter to someone. "I don't know how to be brave anymore," Margaret whispered. "Then let me be brave enough for both of us," Caleb said, "until you remember how." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the small cabin. Inside, something shifted between them, something subtle but significant, like ice beginning to crack under spring sun. "Tell me about Ohio," Margaret said, changing the subject to safer ground. "What was your life like before you came west?" Caleb settled back against the wall, his long legs stretched toward the fire. Ordinary, he said. We had a farm. My parents, my brother, my 2 sisters. Nothing fancy, just hard work and modest returns. I was always the different one, though. My brother loved farming, loved the routine and the predictability. My sisters were content to marry local boys and start families, but I wanted more. Not riches or fame, just space to build something that was mine. Did your family understand? My mother did, Caleb said. She told me once that she'd felt the same way when she was young, that restless feeling like you're supposed to be somewhere else, doing something else. But she'd married my father and had children, and the restlessness faded. She said she hoped I'd find what I was looking for before it was too late. And have you? Margaret asked. Caleb looked at her across the firelight. I found the land. I found the life I wanted to build. But I didn't find anyone to share it with. Until maybe now. Margaret's breath caught. Caleb, I know, he said quickly. You haven't decided. I'm not pressuring you. I'm just telling you the truth. They talked through the evening, sharing stories from their pasts, discussing books they'd read and places they'd been. Margaret learned that Caleb had taught himself to read using his mother's Bible and a dictionary, that he'd once wanted to be a school teacher himself, but had never had the opportunity. Caleb learned about Margaret's father's academic career, about her mother's poetry, about the literary salons where ideas mattered more than social standing. You would have liked my parents, Margaret said. They believed education was the great equalizer, that anyone, regardless of birth, could improve themselves through learning. They were right, Caleb said. I built my homestead with my hands, but I learned how to do it from books. Every winter I order new ones from catalogs, farming manuals, carpentry guides, livestock management. Knowledge is just another kind of tool. It was the most Margaret had ever heard him speak at once, and she realized something important. Caleb North wasn't the simple mountain man people in town assumed he was. He was intelligent, thoughtful, self-educated. He'd chosen isolation not because he couldn't function in society, but because he preferred the company of his own thoughts to the noise of crowds. She understood that. She'd always understood that. I think I judged you unfairly, Margaret admitted. When you first approached me about courting, I thought you were just desperate, that you'd court any woman willing to live on that mountain. And now? Caleb asked. Now I think you're the most honest person I've ever met, Margaret said. And that's terrifying in its own way. Caleb smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face. Honesty is terrifying, but it's also the only foundation worth building on. The storm finally began to ease around midnight. The rain gentled from a torrent to a steady patter, and the wind died down enough that the cabin stopped shaking. Margaret's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, and she could see Caleb fighting sleep as well. You should rest, he said, gesturing to the cot. I'll keep the fire going. I can't take the only bed, Margaret protested. You can and you will, Caleb said firmly. I've slept in worse places than a cabin floor. Besides, I'm used to rough sleeping. Margaret was too tired to argue. She lay down on the cot, which was narrow and lumpy but dry and warm. Caleb added wood to the fire and then settled on the floor with his back against the wall, his coat rolled up as a pillow. Caleb, Margaret said into the darkness. Yeah? Thank you for getting me to shelter, even if it ruins my reputation. Your reputation was already ruined the day you arrived, Caleb said. The rejected mail-order bride, remember? At least now you'll be ruined for something that actually matters, for staying alive. Margaret smiled despite everything. That's a strangely comforting way to look at it. Get some sleep, Margaret. She closed her eyes, listening to the fire crackle and the rain drum on the roof. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Not just physically safe from the storm, but emotionally safe in the presence of someone who saw her clearly and didn't turn away. It was the most dangerous feeling in the world. Margaret woke to pale dawn light filtering through gaps in the cabin walls and the smell of coffee. She sat up, disoriented, and found Caleb crouched by the fire with that same dented pot heating over the flames. Morning, he said. Storm's past. We should head back before too many people are up and about. Margaret's stomach dropped. In the light of day, the reality of their situation came crashing back. They'd spent the night alone in this cabin. Even if nothing had happened, and nothing had, no one would believe that. "My reputation is destroyed, isn't it?" she said. Caleb poured coffee into the chipped cup and handed it to her. "Probably," he said. "I'm sorry for that." "It's not your fault. You saved my life." "Still," Caleb said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "There is one way to protect your reputation." Margaret knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth. "Marry me," Caleb said. "Today. Right now. We go back to town, find a minister, and make it legal before the gossip starts. That way, when people talk, we can say we were already engaged, that the storm just pushed up our timeline." "That's a lie," Margaret said. "It's a small lie to protect you from a much bigger harm," Caleb said, "and it doesn't have to change anything about our actual agreement. We can still take time to get to know each other, still build toward partnership. The only difference is we'll be doing it as husband and wife instead of as people courting." Margaret's mind raced. It was absurd marrying a man she barely knew to avoid scandal. But the alternative was losing her teaching position, losing what little respect she'd earned in Silver Hollow, possibly losing her place at the boarding house. Mrs. Porter ran a respectable establishment. She wouldn't tolerate a resident whose virtue was publicly questioned. "I can't ask you to do that," Margaret said. "To marry me out of obligation." "You're not asking," Caleb said. "I'm offering. And it's not just obligation. I was already courting you with the intention of marriage. This just moves up the schedule." "But we're not ready," Margaret protested. "We barely know each other. What if we're making a terrible mistake?" "Then we'll deal with it together," Caleb said. "But at least you'll have a home and a name that's legally protected. At least you won't be at the mercy of gossip and judgment." Margaret looked at this man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was making. He was offering her safety, partnership, a future. It wasn't the romantic marriage she'd once dreamed of, but it was real and honest and right there in front of her. She thought about the 7 rejection letters. She thought about the women in the general store calling her a dried-up spinster. She thought about Billy Henderson saying she deserved to be happy. Maybe happiness wasn't something that arrived fully formed. Maybe it was something you built, piece by piece, with someone willing to do the building alongside you. "All right," Margaret said. "I'll marry you." Caleb's expression didn't change, but she saw something flash in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or hope. "You're sure?" "No," Margaret said honestly, "but I'm sure enough." They finished their coffee in silence, banked the fire, and loaded back into the wagon. The storm had left the world washed clean and glittering, the sky impossibly blue and the air sharp with cold. As they drove back toward Silver Hollow, Margaret looked at the mountains rising around them and wondered if she was driving toward salvation or disaster. Either way, there was no turning back now. They reached the outskirts of Silver Hollow just as the town was waking up. Smoke rose from chimneys, and a few early risers moved along the boardwalks, preparing for the day ahead. Margaret could feel eyes turning toward them as Caleb drove the wagon down the main street, could practically hear the wheels of gossip beginning to turn. "Where do we find a minister?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Reverend Patterson lives behind the church," Caleb said. "He'll marry us if we ask." "Even without banns being read? Without proper notice?" "This is the frontier, not Boston," Caleb said. "People get married quick out here for all kinds of reasons. He won't ask too many questions." They pulled up in front of the small white church, and Caleb helped Margaret down from the wagon. Her dress was still damp and wrinkled from the storm, her hair escaping from its braid in wild tendrils. She looked nothing like a bride should look. But then again, this was nothing like a wedding should be. The Reverend's house was a modest structure attached to the back of the church. Caleb knocked firmly on the door, and after a moment it opened to reveal a portly man in his 60s, still in his nightshirt and looking thoroughly confused. "Mr. North," Reverend Patterson said, blinking in the morning light, "is something wrong?" "Not wrong exactly," Caleb said. "Reverend, this is Miss Margaret Hale. We'd like you to marry us. Today. This morning." The Reverend's eyebrows shot up. "This morning? But I haven't... There are procedures." "We understand it's irregular," Margaret said, finding her voice. But circumstances have made it necessary. We were caught in yesterday's storm and had to shelter overnight in a line cabin north of town. We want to marry immediately to protect both our reputations." Understanding dawned on Reverend Patterson's face, followed by a flicker of sympathy. "I see. Well, I suppose under the circumstances. Let me get dressed. Come inside and wait in the parlor." They followed him into a small, tidy room filled with books and comfortable furniture. The Reverend disappeared into another room, and Margaret heard the murmur of his wife's voice, surprised and curious. "Are you all right?" Caleb asked quietly. Margaret looked at him, this man who was about to become her husband. "I honestly don't know," she said. "This isn't how I imagined getting married." "How did you imagine it?" "White dress, music, people who loved me standing witness. Time to prepare, to think, to be sure." She laughed shakily. "Not standing in a minister's parlor in a wrinkled dress, marrying a man I've known for less than 2 months to avoid scandal." "We can still wait," Caleb said. "Face the gossip head on. I'll stand by you either way." Margaret shook her head. "No, you were right. Marriage protects us both. And we were moving toward this anyway, just faster than planned." The Reverend returned, now properly dressed, with his wife trailing behind him. Mrs. Patterson was a small, bird-like woman with kind eyes and an expression that suggested she'd seen enough of life not to judge its complications. "Well then," Reverend Patterson said, opening his Bible, "I'll need 2 witnesses. My wife can serve as one. Is there anyone else you'd like to fetch?" "Mrs. Porter," Margaret said suddenly. "From the boarding house. She's been kind to me. I'd like her to know the truth of this." "I'll get her," Caleb said, and disappeared out the door. Margaret stood in the parlor with the Reverend and his wife, feeling surreal and unmoored. Mrs. Patterson offered her tea, which she accepted gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around the warm cup. "Don't look so frightened, dear," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "Caleb North is a good man. A bit solitary, perhaps, but good through and through. You could do much worse." "I know," Margaret said. "It's just all happening so fast." "Life on the frontier often does," the older woman said. "My husband and I married 3 days after we met. That was 37 years ago. Sometimes the quick decisions turn out to be the right ones." Caleb returned with Mrs. Porter, who looked bewildered but not disapproving. The landlady took in Margaret's disheveled appearance and Caleb's serious expression and seemed to understand immediately what had happened. "Well," Mrs. Porter said briskly, "if you're going to do this, at least let me fix your hair, child. You can't get married looking like you've been pulled through a hedge backward." She produced a comb from somewhere and set about repairing Margaret's braid with efficient, gentle hands. "There," she said when she'd finished. "That's better. Still not traditional, but better." Reverend Patterson cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" They arranged themselves in front of the fireplace, Caleb and Margaret facing each other, the Reverend between them with his Bible open, Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Porter standing as witnesses. Morning light streamed through the window, catching dust motes in the air and painting everything in shades of gold. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Patterson began, and Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a physical thing. This was real. This was happening. In a few minutes, she would be married to Caleb North, would belong to him in the eyes of the law and society, would tie her future irrevocably to his. She listened to the familiar words of the ceremony as if from a great distance, her mind struggling to catch up with reality. Caleb's responses were clear and steady, while her own voice trembled slightly on each required phrase. "Do you, Margaret Ann Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Margaret looked at Caleb, at the honesty in his eyes and the strength in his weathered face. She thought about the alternative, returning to the boarding house alone, facing the gossip and judgment, losing her teaching position, being cast out as a fallen woman. But more than that, she thought about the homestead on the mountain, about the way Caleb had spoken to her as an equal, about the possibility of building something real with someone who saw her worth. "I do," she said. "And do you, Caleb James North, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Caleb said without hesitation. "Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. North, you may kiss your bride." Caleb looked at Margaret, a question in his eyes. She nodded almost imperceptibly, and he leaned forward to press a brief, chaste kiss to her lips. It lasted only a moment, but Margaret felt it like an earthquake. The first physical intimacy between them, the seal on vows that would shape the rest of her life. When Caleb pulled back, his eyes held something she couldn't quite name. Not love. They barely knew each other well enough for that. But respect, perhaps. Commitment. A promise that he would honor what they'd just agreed to. "Congratulations," Reverend Patterson said, closing his Bible. "May your marriage be blessed with happiness and prosperity." Mrs. Patterson hugged Margaret warmly. "Come visit us when you can, dear. The mountain can be lonely. It helps to have friends in town." Mrs. Porter was more pragmatic. "You'll need to collect your things from the boarding house," she said, "and I suppose you'll want to inform Mr. Jameson about the teaching position." Reality crashed back in. Margaret was no longer Miss Hale, the school teacher. She was Mrs. North, a married woman who would be expected to leave her job and follow her husband to his mountain homestead. Everything she'd built over the past 2 months was about to change. "I need to talk to my students," Margaret said. "They deserve to know from me, not from gossip." "School doesn't start for another hour," Mrs. Porter said. "You have time to clean up and change clothes at least. Come on." Margaret looked at Caleb, uncertain. He nodded. "Go ahead. I'll take care of filing the marriage certificate with the county clerk. Meet me at the schoolhouse when you're ready." She followed Mrs. Porter back to the boarding house, her mind still reeling. In her room, Mary and Ruth were just waking up, and their eyes went wide when they saw her disheveled state. "Miss Hale," Mary gasped. "Where were you? We were so worried." "It's Mrs. North now," Mrs. Porter said briskly. "She got caught in the storm with Mr. North, spent the night in a line cabin, and married him this morning to preserve both their reputations. Now help her change clothes so she can go say goodbye to her students." The girls scrambled to help, asking questions that Margaret barely heard. She stripped off her damp, wrinkled dress and put on her best one, deep green wool with black trim. Mary rebrushed her hair while Ruth found her good shoes. Within 20 minutes, she looked almost respectable again. "Are you happy?" Ruth asked quietly as Margaret prepared to leave. Margaret paused, considering the question. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me in a year." She walked to the schoolhouse alone, her marriage certificate tucked into her pocket and her heart heavy with the weight of what she was about to do. The children were already arriving, chattering excitedly about the storm and speculating about whether Miss Hale would cancel lessons because of the weather. Their voices died when they saw her standing at the door. "Good morning," Margaret said, managing a smile. "Please take your seats. I have something important to tell you." They filed in silently, sensing that something had changed. Billy Henderson caught her eye, his expression worried, and Margaret had to look away before she started crying. When everyone was seated, she stood at the front of the classroom and folded her hands, the same way she had on her first day of teaching. "Yesterday, I was caught in the storm," she began. "Mr. Caleb North found me and took me to shelter in a line cabin north of town. We were trapped there overnight by the weather." She heard the sharp intake of breath, saw understanding dawn on some of the older students' faces. They knew what it meant for an unmarried woman to spend the night alone with a man. "This morning," Margaret continued, "Mr. North and I were married by Reverend Patterson, which means I can no longer serve as your teacher. Married women don't teach. You all know that. I'll be moving to Mr. North's homestead on the mountain." "But you can't leave, Dosh!" Billy burst out, half rising from his seat. "You're the best teacher we've ever had." "I'm sorry, Billy," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "But this is how things have to be." "It's not fair," one of the girls said tearfully. "Why do you have to quit just because you got married?" "Because those are the rules," Margaret said. "Rules I don't particularly like, but rules nonetheless. Mr. Jameson will find you a new teacher, and I'm sure they'll be wonderful." "They won't be you," Billy said fiercely. Margaret blinked back tears. "No, they won't. But they'll care about you and want you to learn, and that's what matters. You have to promise me something, all of you. Promise me you'll keep reading, Keep asking questions, keep being curious about the world. Education doesn't stop just because I'm leaving. It's something you carry with you forever. The younger children were crying now, and even some of the older boys looked suspiciously damp-eyed. Margaret distributed the few personal books she'd brought to the classroom, giving them to students she thought would appreciate them most. Billy got the volume of Roman history he'd been borrowing. Emma Morrison received a collection of fairy tales. Mrs. North, will you ever come back to visit? Emma asked. I hope so, Margaret said. The mountain is only 2 hours away. I'm not disappearing forever. But even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. Mountain living was demanding, especially in winter. She might not make it to town for months at a time. Caleb appeared in the doorway just as she was finishing her farewells. The children looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and resentment. This was the man who was taking away their teacher. Mr. North, Billy said, standing up with the rigid formality of someone trying to be very adult. Sir, I hope you realize what an exceptional woman you're marrying. She's taught us more in 2 months than any teacher before her. If you don't treat her well, you'll have all of us to answer to. A smile tugged at Caleb's lips. I appreciate the warning, young man. I'll do my best to live up to your expectations. See that you do, Billy said seriously. Margaret hugged each of her students goodbye, blinking back tears that she refused to let fall until she was out of the building. Finally, she and Caleb walked out into the bright morning, leaving the schoolhouse behind. That was harder than I expected, Margaret admitted. I know, Caleb said. But you gave them something valuable in the time you had. That matters. They walked to the land office next, where Mr. Jameson looked shocked to see them together. Mr. North, Miss Hale, what can I do for you? It's Mrs. North now, Caleb said, producing the marriage certificate. As of this morning, which means Margaret needs to resign her teaching position. Jameson's eyes widened. Married? But I thought you were just courting. Circumstances changed, Margaret said quietly. The storm yesterday forced us to shelter together overnight. We married this morning to protect both our reputations. Jameson's face went through several expressions. Surprise, understanding, then something that might have been sympathy. I see. Well, congratulations to you both. Though I'm sorry to lose you as a teacher, Mrs. North. The children have flourished under your instruction. Thank you, Margaret said. I hope you'll find someone suitable to replace me. We will, Jameson said, though he didn't sound convinced. It may take some time, but we will. They filed the necessary paperwork, and Margaret officially ceased to be a teacher. It felt like closing a door she'd only just opened, like losing something precious before she'd fully appreciated its value. Their final stop was the general store, where they purchased supplies for the homestead, flour, sugar, coffee, salt, fabric for new dresses. Margaret stood in the store where she'd been gossiped about just yesterday and tried to ignore the stares and whispers. Is it true? The storekeeper's wife asked, unable to contain her curiosity. You married Caleb North? This morning, Margaret confirmed. Well, the woman said, clearly struggling between disapproval and envy. That was certainly quick. The storm forced our hand, Caleb said evenly, loading supplies into a crate. But we were already courting. This just moved up our plans. Margaret could see the woman calculating, could practically watch her trying to determine if scandal or romance was the better story to tell. In the end, Margaret didn't care which version spread through town. She was leaving Silver Hollow behind, both its judgment and its small kindnesses. They loaded everything into the wagon, including Margaret's trunk from the boarding house. It didn't take long. She still owned so little that it all fit easily. Mrs. Porter had packed a basket of food for them, refusing payment and squeezing Margaret's hand one last time. You write to me if you need anything, the landlady said. Or if things get hard up there. You hear me? I hear you, Margaret said. Thank you for everything. Then they were climbing into the wagon, and Caleb was urging the horses forward, and Silver Hollow was falling away behind them. Margaret looked back once at the town that had rejected her and then grudgingly accepted her, at the schoolhouse where she'd found purpose, at the mountains rising beyond. Then she turned to face forward toward whatever was coming next. The ride up the mountain was quiet. Margaret's emotions were too tangled to voice. Grief at losing her teaching position, anxiety about her hasty marriage, uncertainty about the life that awaited her. Caleb seemed to sense her need for silence and didn't try to fill it with meaningless chatter. When they finally reached the homestead, the sun was high overhead and Margaret's body ached from the long ride. Caleb helped her down from the wagon and led her inside the cabin that was now her home. "I know it's not much," he said, suddenly sounding uncertain. "But I meant what I said about building you a proper bedroom. I'll start on that tomorrow." Margaret looked around the cabin, at the single room that would be her entire world for who knew how long, at the sleeping loft where Caleb presumably slept, at the rough furniture and sparse decorations. It was clean and functional and utterly foreign to everything she'd known. "It's fine," she said, because what else could she say? Caleb showed her where things were stored, food in the larder, tools in the barn, bedding in a chest under the window. He explained his daily routines, the work that needed doing, the rhythms of mountain life. "The chickens need feeding twice a day," he said. "The cows need milking morning and evening. In winter, we'll need to break ice on the water troughs and make sure the stock has enough hay. It's constant work, but we'll share it." "I don't know how to do any of those things," Margaret admitted. "I'll teach you," Caleb said. "Same way I learned, by doing, by making mistakes, by trying again." That evening, Margaret cooked her first meal as a married woman, or tried to. She'd learned some basics in Mrs. Porter's kitchen, but cooking on the cabin's iron stove was different from the boarding house range. The biscuits came out burned on the bottom and raw in the middle. The beans were too salty. The coffee was bitter enough to strip paint. Caleb ate everything without complaint, but Margaret could see him struggling with the biscuits. "I'm sorry," she said miserably. "I'm terrible at this." "You're learning," Caleb said. "First time I tried to make biscuits, I used salt instead of sugar, took one bite and spit it across the room. You're already doing better than that." Despite herself, Margaret smiled. "Really?" "Really," Caleb confirmed. "Give it time. You'll get the hang of it." After dinner, they sat by the fire, both acutely aware of the awkwardness of their situation. They were married, bound by law and custom, but they were essentially strangers sharing a small space. "I'll sleep in the loft," Caleb said. "You can have the main room. I meant what I said. I'll start building a proper bedroom tomorrow. Until then, we'll just figure it out." "Thank you," Margaret said quietly, "for being respectful, for not expecting—" "I don't expect anything you're not ready to give," Caleb interrupted gently. "We made vows today, but we also made an agreement. Partnership first. Everything else comes when it's right for both of us." That night, lying on a makeshift bed Caleb had arranged near the fire, Margaret stared at the ceiling beams and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. Above her, she could hear Caleb moving quietly in the loft, settling down for sleep. She was married to this man, tied to him legally, financially, in every way that mattered, and she barely knew him. But as the fire crackled and the mountain night settled around the cabin, Margaret found herself thinking about the way Caleb had spoken to her students, the care he'd taken with her belongings, the promise in his eyes when he'd said they'd figure it out together. Maybe knowing someone wasn't just about time. Maybe it was about attention, about really seeing each other, about choosing to show up honestly day after day. She'd spent her whole life waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right circumstances. But maybe life wasn't about waiting for perfect conditions. Maybe it was about working with what you had and building something worth keeping. The next weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and learning. Caleb was patient but exacting, showing Margaret how to tend the animals, how to cook on the temperamental stove, how to preserve food and mend clothes, and do the 1,000 small tasks that kept a homestead running. She made countless mistakes. Let the fire go out, spooked the cow during milking, ruined an entire batch of bread. But she also learned. Her hands, once soft and useless, became calloused and capable. Her body, unused to physical labor, grew stronger, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cabin began to feel less foreign and more like something approaching home. Caleb kept his promise about the bedroom, working every spare moment to frame out a small addition to the cabin. He built it with the same careful attention he brought to everything, fitting each board precisely and checking every joint for soundness. Margaret helped when she could, holding boards steady or fetching tools, learning the basics of construction through observation. They talked while they worked, about books they'd read, places they'd been, dreams they'd had. Caleb told her about his childhood in Ohio, about the brother who'd gotten the farm, and the sisters who'd married well. Margaret told him about her parents' literary circle, about the poets and philosophers who'd filled their Boston home with ideas and arguments. "Sounds overwhelming," Caleb said one afternoon as they worked on the bedroom's roof. "It was wonderful," Margaret said. "All those brilliant minds in one room, arguing about Emerson or debating political philosophy. I felt alive in a way I haven't felt since." "Not even when you were teaching?" Caleb asked. Margaret paused, considering. Teaching was different. It was satisfying, meaningful work, but it wasn't the same as being part of those conversations, where ideas mattered more than anything else. "I can't give you that," Caleb said quietly. "I'm educated, but not in that way. I don't know philosophy or poetry." "You know other things," Margaret said. "You know how to read the weather, how to work with your hands, how to survive in a place that would kill most people. That's its own kind of intelligence." Caleb looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You really believe that?" "I do," Margaret said, and she realized with some surprise that she meant it. The bedroom was finished in early November, just before the first serious snow. It was small but private, with a real bed frame that Caleb had built and a window that looked out toward the mountains. Margaret moved her few belongings in, her trunk, her mother's silver brush, the book she'd managed to keep, and felt something settle in her chest. This was hers. Not much, but hers. Winter arrived with a vengeance, bringing snow that piled waist-high and temperatures that made the inside of the cabin feel like the only warm place in the universe. They were snowed in for days at a time, completely isolated from the outside world. Margaret had feared that isolation, had worried that being trapped with a virtual stranger would be unbearable. Instead, she found it almost peaceful. They fell into rhythms, morning chores, afternoon projects, evening meals by the fire. Caleb taught Margaret to play chess using pieces he'd carved himself. She read aloud to him in the evenings from books they both enjoyed. They cooked together, cleaned together, worked together with an ease that surprised them both. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk about deeper things, about what they wanted from life, about their fears and hopes, about the future they were building together. "Do you regret it?" Caleb asked one night as they sat by the fire, snow howling outside. "Marrying me?" Margaret thought about the question carefully. "I regret the circumstances," she said honestly. "I regret losing my teaching position. But marrying you? No, I don't regret that." "Even though we barely knew each other?" "We're getting to know each other now," Margaret said, "and I like what I'm learning." Caleb smiled, and Margaret realized she'd come to treasure that rare expression. "I like what I'm learning too," he said. By December, they'd settled into something that felt almost like a real marriage. Not romantic, not yet, but genuine. They moved around each other with increasing familiarity, learning each other's habits and preferences. Caleb took his coffee black and strong. Margaret liked hers with cream and sugar. Caleb woke at dawn regardless of the season. Margaret was most alert in the evenings. Small things, but they mattered. One morning, Margaret woke to find Caleb already up and working in the main room. She emerged from the bedroom to see him carefully arranging something on the table, a small pine tree, cut fresh and decorated with strings of dried berries and bits of colored cloth. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "Christmas is in a week," Caleb said, looking almost embarrassed. I know it's not much, but I wanted to mark it somehow. Our first Christmas together." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. In all the adjustment and work, she'd lost track of the calendar. But Caleb had remembered. "It's perfect," she said softly. They spent Christmas Day resting from their usual labor, eating a special meal that Margaret had actually managed to cook without disaster, and exchanging small gifts. Caleb gave her a beautiful wooden box he'd carved, with her initials inlaid on the lid. Margaret gave him a shirt she'd sewn from fabric they'd bought in town, her stitches careful and even. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb said, running his hands over the fabric. "I wanted to," Margaret said. "Partners, remember? We take care of each other." That night, as they sat by the fire with full stomachs and quiet contentment, Caleb reached over and took Margaret's hand. It was the first time he'd initiated physical contact beyond what was necessary for daily work, and Margaret felt her heart skip. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For giving me a chance," Caleb said. "For seeing past the circumstances to what we could build together. For being here." Margaret squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own now, the strength that had held them both through difficult months. "Thank you for asking," she said, "for seeing me when nobody else would." They sat like that for a long time, hands linked, watching the fire burn down to embers. And Margaret realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. She was falling in love with her husband. Not the wild, desperate love of poetry and romance, but something steadier and deeper, a love built on respect and shared work and quiet mornings and honest conversations. A love that grew like the homestead itself, one careful addition at a time. It wasn't what she'd expected when she'd arrived in Montana Territory all those months ago. It was better. Winter deepened, and with it, Margaret's understanding of what it meant to truly share a life with someone. The isolation that had once frightened her became a kind of sanctuary. Up here on the mountain, there were no rejection letters, no gossip, no judgment about being too educated or too plain or too anything. There was only the work, the weather, and the two of them learning to move as one unit instead of two separate people occupying the same space. By January, Margaret could milk the cow without being kicked, could bake bread that didn't double as a doorstop, and could read the sky well enough to predict when a storm was coming. Her hands bore scars from learning, a burn from the stove, a cut from an axe that had slipped, calluses from hauling water and splitting wood. Each mark was proof that she was becoming something she'd never imagined, competent at survival. One evening, as they worked together preparing supper, Caleb said something that had clearly been on his mind for days. "I've been thinking about spring," he said, peeling potatoes with practiced efficiency. "About expanding the herd. I've got enough savings to buy another 10 head of cattle, maybe some sheep, but it would mean more work for both of us." "I can handle more work," Margaret said, stirring the pot of stew. "I know you can," Caleb said. "That's not what concerns me. I'm worried about you being happy here, about whether this life is enough for you." Margaret set down her spoon and turned to face him fully. "What makes you think it isn't?" "You were a teacher," Caleb said. "You had students who loved you, a purpose beyond just surviving. Now you're up here cooking and cleaning and tending animals. I know it's necessary work, but is it fulfilling?" It was a question Margaret had asked herself repeatedly during those long winter days. She missed her students desperately, missed Billy's earnest questions and Emma's sweet smile, missed the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn on a young face. But she'd also discovered something unexpected in the physical labor of the homestead, a different kind of fulfillment. "It's different," she said carefully. "Teaching felt like I was contributing to something larger than myself. This feels more immediate, more essential. We eat because I learned to cook. The animals survive because I learned to tend them. There's a directness to it that teaching didn't have." "But do you miss it?" Caleb pressed. "Every day," Margaret admitted. "But I don't regret leaving. Does that make sense?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "It does. I miss Ohio sometimes. Miss my family, miss the familiar landscapes. But I don't regret coming here. Some things are worth the sacrifice." "Some things are," Margaret agreed, and when their eyes met across the cabin, she saw something new in his expression. Not just respect or partnership, but something warmer, something that made her heart quicken. That night, after the supper dishes were washed and the fire banked for the evening, Caleb stopped Margaret as she headed toward her bedroom. "Margaret," he said, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that she'd never heard before. "Can we talk?" "Of course," she said, returning to sit beside him on the bench near the fire. Caleb took a breath, his hands clasped between his knees. "We've been married 4 months now, and I know we agreed that partnership came first, that everything else would happen when we were both ready. But I need you to know something." Margaret's pulse raced. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you," Caleb said simply. "Maybe I have been since that day on the mountain trail, when you looked at those peaks like they were a promise. But I know it for certain now. I love the way you tackle every new challenge, like it's a puzzle to solve. I love how you read to me in the evenings, doing different voices for different characters. I love that you're not afraid to tell me when you think I'm wrong. I love you. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Caleb, I'm not asking for anything, he continued quickly. I'm not pressuring you to feel the same way. I just wanted you to know. We built this marriage on honesty, and it wouldn't be honest to keep this to myself any longer. You fool, Margaret said, laughing through her tears. I love you too. I've been falling in love with you for weeks and was terrified to say anything because we agreed this was supposed to be practical. Caleb's face transformed with something that could only be called joy. You love me? I love you, Margaret confirmed. Not because you rescued me from the storm or gave me a home when I needed one. I love you because you see me, really see me, and you value what you see. Because you're patient with my mistakes and proud of my accomplishments. Because you make me laugh and challenge me to think and never once made me feel like I had to be less than I am. Caleb reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I never want you to be less than you are. I fell in love with exactly who you are, sharp mind, stubborn pride, terrible biscuits and all. My biscuits are improving, Margaret protested, but she was smiling. They are, Caleb agreed. Everything about our life together keeps improving. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Margaret didn't pull away. She met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it was nothing like the brief, obligatory kiss at their wedding. This was real and deep and full of months of growing affection finally allowed to show itself. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I want this to be a real marriage, he said quietly. Not just partnership, but everything marriage is supposed to be, if you want that too. I want that, Margaret said. I want all of it. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. They were no longer two strangers making the best of an awkward situation, but partners who'd chosen each other deliberately and completely. The physical distance they'd maintained began to close, and Margaret moved her belongings from the small bedroom to the loft where Caleb slept. Are you sure? He asked as she climbed the ladder, her arms full of quilts. I'm sure, Margaret said. We're married, Caleb. Truly married now, in every sense. I don't want to sleep apart anymore. The intimacy that developed between them was tentative at first, both of them learning each other with patience and care. But it grew more natural with time, becoming just another part of their shared life, as ordinary and extraordinary as morning coffee or evening conversations by the fire. February arrived with temperatures so cold that water froze solid in its bucket overnight. They were completely snowed in for nearly 2 weeks, seeing nothing but white in every direction and each other's faces. But instead of feeling trapped, Margaret felt cocooned, safe in their small cabin while the world raged outside. During those snowbound weeks, Margaret began to notice changes in her body. A persistent nausea in the mornings, unusual fatigue despite sleeping well, a sensitivity to certain smells that made cooking challenging. At first, she attributed it to the heavy winter diet or perhaps a mild illness. But when her monthly courses failed to arrive, understanding dawned with a mixture of joy and terror. She was pregnant. Margaret told Caleb on a morning when the sun finally broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered landscape into a field of diamonds. They were eating breakfast, oatmeal with dried berries, when she set down her spoon and simply said it. I'm with child. Caleb froze, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. You're certain? As certain as I can be without a doctor, Margaret said. All the signs are there. I think probably July, maybe early August. For a long moment, Caleb didn't move. Then he set down his cup very carefully and came around the table to kneel in front of her chair, taking both her hands in his. How do you feel? He asked. Are you frightened? Terrified, Margaret admitted. I've never been around babies much. I don't know the first thing about mothering, and giving birth up here, so far from town, from a doctor. Hey, Caleb said gently, squeezing her hands. We'll figure it out. Same way we figured out everything else. Together. What if something goes wrong? Margaret whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Women die in childbirth, Caleb, especially out here, with no medical help nearby. Then we'll make sure you have medical help, Caleb said firmly. When the time comes, we'll go to town early. Stay with Mrs. Porter, have the doctor nearby. I won't let anything happen to you, Margaret. I promise. Margaret wanted to point out that some things were beyond his control, that promises couldn't prevent hemorrhaging or infection or any of the dozen things that could go wrong. But she also saw the fierce determination in his eyes and knew that he would do everything humanly possible to keep her safe. Are you happy about this? She asked. You wanted children. You made that clear from the beginning, but is this too soon? Caleb's face softened. Margaret, I'm happier than I have words for. A child, our child, growing inside you, it's more than I ever hoped for. Yes, it's sooner than expected, but the best things usually are. He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach, and Margaret covered it with her own. A baby. Their baby. The physical proof that this marriage had become something real and vital and permanent. Over the following weeks, as winter gradually loosened its grip, they talked endlessly about the baby. Caleb began planning modifications to the cabin, a cradle to build, space to clear for a nursery area. Margaret sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric, her stitches careful and precise, imagining the small person who would wear them. Do you hope for a son or a daughter? She asked one evening as they worked on their separate projects by the fire. I used to think I wanted sons, Caleb said, planing a board that would become part of the cradle. Thought about them helping with the ranch work, carrying on the homestead. But honestly, I don't care anymore. Boy or girl, as long as they're healthy and loved. The world is harder for girls, Margaret said quietly. I know that firsthand. All those expectations about what we should be, how we should behave. The way we're judged for things men never think twice about. Then we'll raise a daughter who knows her own worth, Caleb said, who understands that being intelligent and capable and strong-willed aren't flaws. We'll raise her to be exactly who she is, same as we do with a son. Margaret felt love surge through her so powerfully it was almost painful. How did I get so lucky? How did the woman 7 men rejected end up with the one man who sees past every stupid convention society clings to? You weren't lucky, Caleb said, meeting her eyes. You were patient. You waited until someone worthy of you came along. Spring arrived in late March with dramatic suddenness. The snow melted so fast it created streams where none had existed, and the entire mountain seemed to explode with green. Wildflowers covered the meadows in waves of color, purple lupine, yellow balsam root, red Indian paintbrush. The cattle that had spent months sheltering in the barn emerged thin but healthy, and the creek ran high and clear with snowmelt. Margaret's pregnancy was showing now, a gentle swell beneath her dresses that Caleb looked at with undisguised wonder. Her morning sickness had faded, replaced by surprising energy and appetite. She threw herself into spring planting with enthusiasm, putting in a garden that would feed them through the next winter. Potatoes and carrots, beans and squash, herbs for cooking and healing. You're doing too much, Caleb fretted, watching her bend over the garden rows. I'm pregnant, not fragile, Margaret retorted. Women have been working through pregnancy since the beginning of time. I'm fine. But she appreciated his concern, the way he checked on her constantly, the way he took over the heavier tasks without being asked. She appreciated even more the way he talked to her belly in the evenings, telling their unborn child about the homestead they were building, the life they would share. In May, when the trails were finally passable, they made their first trip to Silver Hollow since before the wedding. Margaret was nervous about facing the town, about the gossip that had surely flourished in her absence. But she was also eager to see friendly faces, to reassure her students that she hadn't forgotten them. The reception they received surprised her. Mrs. Porter hugged her fiercely and immediately began fussing over her pregnancy. The doctor examined her and pronounced her healthy. Several townspeople stopped them on the street to congratulate them and ask about life on the mountain. But the best moment came when Margaret visited the schoolhouse. A new teacher had taken over, a pleasant young woman named Sarah, but she graciously allowed Margaret's former students to gather outside during recess. Mrs. North! Emma Morrison shrieked, launching herself at Margaret with such force she nearly knocked her over. Only Caleb's steadying hand kept her upright. Careful, he said, amused. She's carrying precious cargo. Billy Henderson, now 14 and sprouting up like a weed, grinned widely. You're going to have a baby? That's wonderful, Mrs. North. They surrounded her, all talking at once, telling her about their continued studies. asking about mountain life, examining her belly with the frank curiosity of children. Margaret answered their questions patiently, feeling her heart swell with affection for these young people she'd taught for such a brief time. "We miss you," Billy said seriously. "Miss Sarah is nice, but she's not you." "You're sweet to say that," Margaret said, "but I haven't gone far, just up the mountain. You can write to me. I'd love to hear about what you're learning." "Will you bring the baby to visit when it's born?" Emma asked. "I promise," Margaret said, and meant it. As they prepared to leave town, laden with supplies and gifts from well-wishers, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her. She'd been so afraid of Silver Hollow's judgment, but in her absence something had shifted. The scandalous rushed marriage had transformed into a romantic story, the mountain man who'd seen what others missed, the rejected bride who'd found true love. It wasn't quite accurate, but it was kinder than the truth. "People surprise you," she said to Caleb as they drove back up the mountain. "Sometimes they do," he agreed, "though I prefer it up here where we don't have to worry about surprising anyone." Summer arrived in full glory, and with it, Margaret's belly grew round and heavy. By July she was waddling more than walking, her back aching and her feet swollen, but she'd never felt more alive, more purposeful. She was growing a person, taking the love she and Caleb had built and transforming it into something entirely new. True to his word, Caleb insisted they relocate to town as her due date approached. They left the homestead in the capable hands of a neighbor who agreed to check on the stock, and moved into rooms at Mrs. Porter's boarding house. The landlady hovered over Margaret like a mother hen, ensuring she rested and ate well and didn't exert herself. The doctor examined her regularly and pronounced everything progressing normally. But as July turned to August with no sign of the baby, Margaret grew anxious. "What if something's wrong?" she asked Caleb one sweltering afternoon. "What if the baby doesn't want to come?" "The baby will come when it's ready," Caleb said, fanning her with a folded newspaper. "Babies have their own schedule." He was right. 2 days later, Margaret woke before dawn with a pain that took her breath away. By the time the sun rose, she was in full labor, with the doctor and Mrs. Porter in attendance and Caleb pacing outside the room like a caged animal. Labor was harder than anything Margaret had ever experienced, harder than frontier work, harder than learning to survive on the mountain, harder than facing rejection and rebuilding her life. Pain came in waves that obliterated thought, that reduced her to something purely physical and primal. But between the waves, there were moments of clarity. Mrs. Porter's steady voice coaching her to breathe, the doctor's confident hands, the knowledge that Caleb waited just beyond the door, that she wasn't alone in this. And finally, after hours that felt like years, a baby's cry split the air, sharp and indignant and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, placing the tiny, squalling bundle on Margaret's chest. "A healthy baby girl." Margaret looked down at her daughter, red-faced and furious, with a shock of dark hair and eyes squeezed shut against the brightness of the world, and felt love unlike anything she'd ever known crash over her like a wave. This was her child, hers and Caleb's, the physical manifestation of everything they'd built together. "Can I come in?" Caleb's voice came from the doorway, rough with emotion. "Come meet your daughter," Margaret said, her own voice thick with tears. Caleb entered slowly, as if afraid he might shatter the moment. He approached the bed and looked down at the baby, and Margaret watched as every emotion she'd just experienced played across his face: wonder, love, fierce protectiveness. "She's perfect," he breathed. "Margaret, she's absolutely perfect." "Do you want to hold her?" Margaret asked. Caleb accepted the baby with trembling hands, cradling her against his chest with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so large and work-roughened. The baby quieted almost immediately, as if she recognized something essential about the man holding her. "Hello, little one," Caleb murmured. "I'm your father. I've been waiting to meet you for months. I built you a cradle and planted a garden and made sure your mother was safe while you were growing. And I promise to love you and protect you and teach you everything I know about surviving and thriving in this world." Margaret wiped at her streaming eyes, overcome by the sight of her mountain man husband holding their daughter with such tender awe. "What should we name her?" Caleb asked, looking up at Margaret. Margaret had been thinking about names for months, but in this moment only one felt right. Elizabeth, she said, after my mother. She was strong and creative and refused to let the world diminish her. I want our daughter to be the same. Elizabeth North, Caleb said, testing the name. It's perfect. She's perfect. You're perfect. Hardly perfect, Margaret said with a tired laugh. I just screamed through 12 hours of labor and said things that would make a sailor blush. Still perfect, Caleb insisted, leaning down to kiss her forehead while carefully balancing their daughter. My amazing, brilliant, impossibly strong wife, who just gave me the greatest gift I could imagine. They stayed in town for 2 weeks, allowing Margaret to recover and Elizabeth to grow stronger before attempting the journey to the homestead. During that time, the baby became something of a town sensation. Margaret's former students visited in a steady stream, bringing small gifts and exclaiming over Elizabeth's tiny fingers and toes. Mrs. Porter spoiled them all shamelessly, cooking meals and doing laundry, and generally treating Margaret like fragile porcelain. But Margaret was eager to go home, to the mountain cabin that had become more precious to her than any Boston townhouse could have been. When they finally loaded into the wagon with Elizabeth bundled in blankets, Margaret felt excitement rather than trepidation. "Ready?" Caleb asked, taking the reins. "Ready," Margaret confirmed, cradling their daughter against her chest. The homestead looked different to Margaret's eyes now, not just as the place she'd learned to survive, but as the home where she would raise her child. The garden she'd planted had flourished in their absence. The cabin looked solid and welcoming, and the mountains rose around them like protective walls. They settled back into their routines, but everything was different now, with Elizabeth in their lives. Caleb built a cradle that rocked beside their bed in the loft. Margaret learned to cook with one hand while holding the baby in the other. They took turns walking the floor when Elizabeth fussed at night, both of them bleary-eyed but content. One afternoon in late August, when Elizabeth was sleeping peacefully in her cradle and Margaret was shelling peas on the porch, Caleb sat down beside her with an expression that suggested he had something on his mind. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About sons," Caleb said. "About how I told you when we first met that I wanted sons to help with the homestead, to carry on what I've built here." Margaret's hand stilled on the peas. And I realized something watching you with Elizabeth," Caleb continued. "Watching the way you teach her even now, talking to her about everything, reading to her even though she can't possibly understand. I realized that legacy isn't about sons or daughters. It's about passing on values, teaching the next generation to be strong and capable and kind. Elizabeth will learn this land same as any son would. She'll know how to read the weather and tend stock and survive hard times. But she'll also know books and ideas, because you'll teach her those things. She'll have everything we can give her." "You really believe that?" Margaret asked, her heart full. "I know it," Caleb said. "I used to think inheritance was about sons carrying on the family name and working the family land. But you've taught me it's about so much more. It's about raising a person who knows their own worth, who can think and act independently, who contributes something meaningful to the world. Boy or girl doesn't matter. Elizabeth is our legacy, and she's perfect exactly as she is." Margaret set aside the peas and took Caleb's hand. "You know what amazes me most? How much we've both changed. I came to Montana Territory thinking I needed a husband to be complete, that my worth was tied to whether some man wanted me. You thought you needed sons to validate your life's work, but we were both wrong." "We were," Caleb agreed. "What we needed was each other, partnership, someone who sees us clearly and loves us anyway." "Not anyway," Margaret corrected, "because of who we are. All of it, the sharp edges and the soft spots and everything in between." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon sun paint the mountains gold. Inside the cabin, Elizabeth made small sleeping sounds, and Margaret felt a contentment so profound it was almost frightening. She'd lost so much: her parents, her first attempts at building a life in Montana, her teaching position. But she'd gained something infinitely more valuable: a true home, a real marriage, and a family built on honesty and mutual respect. As summer faded into fall and the aspens turned brilliant gold against the darkening pines, life on the homestead settled into new rhythms. Elizabeth grew from a sleepy newborn into an alert infant who watched everything with serious gray eyes. Margaret found ways to work with the baby strapped to her back in a carrier Caleb had fashioned from canvas and leather. Together, they harvested the garden, preserved food for winter, and prepared the homestead for another cycle of snow and cold. On a crisp October afternoon, exactly 1 year after the storm that had changed everything, Margaret stood on the porch holding Elizabeth while Caleb worked in the barn. She looked out at the land they were building together, the expanded pastures, the thriving garden, the additions to the cabin, and marveled at how far they'd come. A year ago, she'd been the mail-order bride nobody wanted, teaching school to survive and trying to convince herself that independence was enough. Now she was a wife, a mother, a partner in a life that challenged and fulfilled her in equal measure. She traded one kind of teaching for another, would trade books and blackboards for showing Elizabeth how to read the sky and understand the seasons, how to think critically and speak her mind and never let anyone make her feel less than she was. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around both her and Elizabeth. "About second chances," Margaret said, leaning back against him. "About how 7 men rejected me, and I thought that meant something was wrong with me. But really, they were just clearing the path for the one man who actually saw me." "I wasn't the only one who needed to see," Caleb said quietly. "You needed to see yourself too, needed to understand that your worth wasn't determined by whether someone chose you, but by who you are when you choose yourself." "Is that what I did?" Margaret asked. "Chose myself?" "That's exactly what you did," Caleb said. "When you started teaching, when you refused to marry me out of pity or desperation, when you demanded respect and partnership instead of just accepting rescue. You chose yourself first, and that made it possible for us to choose each other." Margaret turned in his arms to face him, Elizabeth nestled between them. "I love you, Caleb North, not because you gave me a home or because you're the father of my child. I love you because you're the first person who ever looked at me and saw exactly who I was, too educated and too opinionated and too everything, and thought, yes, that's exactly what I want." "I love you, Margaret North," Caleb said, kissing her softly. "And I'll thank those 7 fools every day for the rest of my life. Their loss was the greatest gift I ever received." Elizabeth chose that moment to make her opinion known, letting out a small squawk of protest at being squished between her parents. They both laughed, and Caleb took the baby so Margaret could go inside and start supper. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the small cabin glowed with lamplight and echoed with the sounds of family. Elizabeth's babbling, Margaret's humming, Caleb's low voice reading from the newspaper they'd gotten on their last trip to town. It wasn't the life Margaret had imagined for herself back in Boston, or even the life she'd hoped for when she first became a mail-order bride. It was better. Years would pass, and Elizabeth would grow strong and capable on the mountain, learning to read by age 4 and to shoot by age 7, to think critically and work tirelessly, and never apologize for being intelligent or ambitious. She would eventually teach in the Silver Hollow schoolhouse herself, following in her mother's footsteps but blazing her own trail. Other children would come, a son born 2 years after Elizabeth and another daughter 3 years after that, and the homestead would expand to accommodate the growing family. But on that October evening, with their first year of marriage behind them and a lifetime ahead, Margaret and Caleb were simply content. They'd found what neither had known they were searching for, not rescue or convenience or practical arrangement, but real partnership. The kind of love that grows from shared labor and honest conversation and choosing each other every single day. Margaret had been the mail-order bride nobody wanted. But Caleb North had asked a simple question: "Will you give me sons?" And in answering it, she'd found something more valuable than she'd ever imagined. Not just a daughter instead of a son, not just a home instead of rejection, but a true marriage built on respect and equality and genuine affection. 7 men had turned her away, unable to see past society's narrow definitions of what a woman should be. But one mountain man had looked at her with clear eyes and seen not a collection of flaws to be corrected, but a partner to be cherished. And in the end, that one clear-eyed view was worth infinitely more than 7 blind rejections. As Margaret moved around the cabin preparing supper, occasionally pausing to kiss Caleb or stroke Elizabeth's soft cheek, she understood something fundamental. Happiness wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you built, brick by brick, choice by choice, with someone who was willing to do the building alongside you. And she and Caleb had built something beautiful.